Greetings to Professor Xolela Manu. Can you hear me, Bud Xolela? Are they visible there? Can you hear me? Greetings, Professor Manu. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? He's muted. He has to go.
You're not muted because I hear you. I hear you.
Oh, is that Prof Krista Johnson?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes.
How are you?
Okay, I can hear Prof Mankru.
Okay. Can you say something, Professor Xolela? Can you say something so I can hear you? I can't hear him. And he's the one who needs to start because he's picking.
And I can hear you.
He's picking his daughter.
That's weird.
I
can actually hear. I can hear Olila.
I want to start with him because I understand he's picking his daughter. I want him to start. Is that okay? Guys, are you seeing this challenge? Let's fix it. Where's call isolate? I'm going to introduce, in the meantime, I'm going to introduce Professor Krista Johnson. And then when Professor Xolela is on, then I will go back to him.
That's weird.
This is for me the most emotional because I'm attached to Prof Manu and Prof Krista Johnson because of my Howard HU living there. Krista Johnson is professor and director of the Center for African Studies at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She is also the co-convener of the Howard University Women and Gender Studies Collective, Gender Studies Collective. She received her PhD in political science from Northwestern University and has published on a wide range of topics including health policy, gender, and HIV prevention, global health governance in Africa, and race and racism in international relations. Johnson specializes in African politics with a particular focus on social movements and health policy in sub-Saharan Africa. Can we try? Can we?
He's going to log on again. Okay. And after you have done speaking, switch off the mic. So you speak, and if you want them to respond, you switch off the mic.
My mic is off now.
Can you respond? Right.
Oh, the pork meat. I didn't eat it. I'm gonna eat it for dinner. So it's got nothing to do with me. Xolela Xolela is important, and then I want him to hear what I'm gonna say when I introduce him. He tried to come. He wanted to be here, but
And can you hear me?
oh yes,
And can you hear me?
yes.
So it looks like when the video is on, the audio somehow disappears. I don't know. Oh, can you hear me?
And then
See, you can't hear me. They can't hear me. So I have
We
to
can
turn off
hear
the
you.
camera.
We can hear you.
It looks like.
We can hear you.
So let me turn off the camera. No. Yes.
He can't.
Oh, you can. Okay. Thanks for having me here. I have changed the title of my paper somewhat from what I had initially submitted. Now it is called Theorizing Black Biography in South Africa, Writing Mandela. I'm just going to focus on what I've been doing over the past 10 years or more, working on this biography. Now, in as much as I'm wary of saying I'm the first African to write a biography of Nelson Mandela, that fact is important only to the extent that it speaks to a larger problem in South African scholarship about Mandela. It's a lacuna that has, at least when it comes to biography, well, and in other fields too, that has been left almost exclusively to a white Anglo-American cast of writers and academics. There's nothing wrong with that on its own, except that we all bring our own perspectives, backgrounds, experiences to the interpretation of history. And the writing of Mandela biographies has come to resemble something I call ethnobiography. And by that, I simply mean a genre that relies on old colonial anthropological tropes about Mandela, but also about African societies in general. Reading these biographies, you would be forgiven for thinking that African people lived in some kind of what Leroy Vale calls a traditional pickle, smothered in traditional brine. Biography after biography tells us about Mandela's leadership formation as taking place around the court of Chief Jongindaba in his kraal as he mediates disputes among villages until the setting of the sun. I'm not making this up. This is the actual language you find in these biographies. And I could go on and quoting from them, but they basically say the same thing. So I'll just quote a couple. One is from Martin Meredith, who argues that Mandela watched at close quarters how the regent, that is Chief Jongindaba, exercised chiefly power at tribal meetings, and that's the word that keeps cropping up, tribe. At tribal meetings at the Great Place, when high-ranking councillors gathered to discuss both local and national issues, Mandela observed how the chief would take care to hear all opinions, listening in silence to whatever criticism was made. It was a style of leadership which made a profound impression upon Mandela. Peter Limb also writes, Mandela's years at the Great Place impressed upon him the African tradition of leadership, democracy in its purest form. Anthony Sampson says the same thing. The regent listened for hours, impassively and silently, until finally at sunset, he tried to produce a consensus from the contrasting views. Repeated enough, what happens with these kinds of stories is that they congeal into an orthodoxy about African timberland in this particular case in the Transkei. So what I sought to do with my work is actually to bring something that no biography of Mandela has ever done before, which actually was to discuss the history of modernity in the Transkei. How African people actually built a hybrid model of leadership. And I go into the history of the Transkei and how the Transkei as a region became the kind of the one place in South Africa, number one, that was not settled by whites. And that's because of the resistance that had preceded the time that they had to cross the Kai River into the Transkei. That is the British and the Cape colonial governments. They were basically too scared to cross over and to fight the kingdoms in the Transkei. What they did, of course, was to set up some kind of indirect rule. And key to that indirect rule was an institution called the Bunga, the Transkei Territories General Council. It's a quasi-parliamentary body that brought chiefs and magistrates, white magistrates, together to discuss public policy. Of course, the chiefs were in a subordinate position to these magistrates, but they come nonetheless, and they would discuss budgets, they would discuss agricultural policies, education, and all of that. One of the most important, actually, achievements of the Bunga was that it was the organization that made funding, provided funding, the initial funding for the University of Fort Hare. And it continued to fund Fort Hare for many years to come. But the Bunga also invested in agricultural projects that Fort Hare was starting. And Mandela's father was an important member of the Bunga. Now, in all the biographies, he's simply dismissed as a pagan. That's what Tom Lodge calls him. And that's what Anthony Sampson also calls him. A pagan who never ventured beyond his village and his homestead. But when I actually looked at the archive, and no biographer, by the way, has looked at the archive that I looked at. When I actually looked at the archive, I found a treasure trove of the proceedings of the Bunga, which bring out not only the debates that took place in this body, but also the particular contributions made by Mandela's father in his own voice, and by the regent himself, the chief, right, whom we were led to believe only existed and limited his leadership to what was happening around the court, around the kraal. And in fact, when you look at this record, you find that the Tembu royal family was deeply enmeshed with colonial modernity, if you like, through the Bunga. So to understand Mandela and to understand his leadership and his statesmanship, if you like, you have to bring in this history. That's the first point. The second point is you will never find in any of the biographies the history of Mandela's family, the Tembo Royal family's role as the biggest allies of the colonial governments. The Tembo Royal family were such a dependable ally of the British and the Cape colonial governments that they led the attack against the Xhosa resistance. Reading the biographies again, you'd be forgiven to think, and Mandela creates this impression himself, actually, that he comes from this long line of Xhosa warriors who fought the resistance, who led the resistance in the 19th century. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, his uncle, King Gangelizwe, was probably the most egregious of these Tembu kings in the fight to put down the resistance. Hence, the Tembu Royal family was given this leading role in the Bunga, somewhat as a reward. Now, having said that, I must emphasize that this is not selling out, as we would say in modern political parlance. This is a kind of pragmatic alliance building that happened not only in South Africa, but all over, actually in colonized societies in general, not just Africa, where groups of the colonized would kind of form these shifting alliances in their own battles with their own rivals in their neighborhoods. But this pragmatism, if you like, and to the extent that it spilled over, of course, into the Bunga, is a long line in the development of many African leaders. But you would never get that if you limited yourself only to what was happening around the kraal in the village. So that's one orthodoxy that I set out to criticize and is essentially to displace, if you like, in our understanding of Mandela. The second canard or orthodoxy is the notion that Mandela was a member of the South African Communist Party. And because he was a member of the Communist Party, he acted on its behalf in creating Umkhonto weSizwe. This has been repeated so many times, despite Mandela's denials. And Mandela has denied this membership from the 1950s all the way to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, for 4 decades. Now, Mandela was not the kind of person who would deny, so-called unsavory alliances. He was always very loyal, whether it was Fidel Castro or Gaddafi or Arafat. He was always very loyal to those who had supported the liberation struggle. Why this insistence that Mandela was a member of the Communist Party? Well, it rests on such flimsy evidence as him attending a meeting in Johannesburg in December 1960. And nothing more than that, except circumstantial evidence that can be interpreted in so many ways. In my view, this focus on Mandela as a communist has to be read really within this Anglo-American culture, in which being a communist is such a dominant factor in the thinking of the scholars and the intellectual culture. I mean, if you go to the townships and you say, Mandela was present at a Communist Party meeting, people would say, so what? But it has taken up so much space in the scholarly literature that one suspects that part of it, not all of it, is part of this culture of red baiting. In fact, the person who came up with this notion, Stephen Ellis, went so far as to say this is important because it informed the ANC's policies when it took power in 1994. Now, anybody who thinks that the ANC adopted communist or socialist policies when it came to power is just blind to reality. The reality of a crony capitalism that grew and got embedded within the ANC. So that's one canard, if you like, one orthodoxy that I spend a whole lot of time. The important thing, as I conclude on this particular topic, is that none of these writers, none of these scholars, in fact, there is no attention at all to the larger and more consequential issue of the Cold War, right? How Mandela was, in fact, affected by the larger policies of the United States and Britain in particular. As they, in fact, if you want to understand the processes leading up to Mandela's arrest, the documentation, the archives, that none of these biographers have used as well, right? These are the National Security Archives in the United States. There's document after document that shows how the State Department, how the Kennedy administration, how the Eisenhower administration were having these military relationships with the apartheid government. Now, the CIA won't release the files, the Mandela files, right? But the documents of the American government at that time indicate that because the US government had this close military relationship with the apartheid government, Mandela would have been a threat not only to the apartheid government, but also to the American government. So instead of a focus on Mandela and his so-called communism, which distracts really from this larger issue of the American relationship with the apartheid government and how that redounded on Mandela. The third, and I'm going to close on this, on the third orthodoxy that I seek to displace is in terms of just the historical writing, the mode of employment, if you like, drawing on the work of the historian Hayden White. By this notion of a mode of employment, what White is talking about, essentially borrowing from the work of a literary scholar, Northrop Frye, is that history is always written as a literary document. It's told as a narrative, and the dominant narrative in he identifies 4 forms of employment or compositional styles. The first is the romantic narrative, right? And this is the narrative whose metaphor is captured, which is captured in the metaphor of the knight in shining armor, right? The hero who shows up and saves the nation in the case of Mandela, right? Who almost exclusively liberates South Africa, right? That's the romantic narrative, right? But it's characterized by this idea of the triumph of good over evil, right? The victory over apartheid. And Mandela biographies have almost without fail given us this interpretation of his life and his political leadership. The second form of employment or compositional style is comedic, right? But at the center of which is this idea, not in the sense of comedy, but in the sense of a reconciliation of warring visions of rivals. Right now in South Africa, you can bring that to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as a narrative, as a comedic narrative, right? Then the third is satire, all right? The ironic sense of writing, which has really come in very disjointed forms in the criticism of Mandela. And I'm not talking about the crazy criticism that, an ill-informed criticism that he sold out. I reject that absolutely. Nobody spends 27 years in jail to sell out. But it's important to be critical of Mandela, and I was often critical of him. But that didn't stop me from having fruitful engagements with him. And in fact, he seems to appreciate that someone could do that. So the one mode of employment that I bring in is the fourth one, which is tragedy. Now, this is counterintuitive for many people. How could I talk about Mandela's story as tragic, or of Mandela as a tragic hero? And this reaction, right, is autobiographical. As a Black South African, I find it more productive in terms of focusing on the suffering, not just the victory at the end, but on the suffering that Mandela went through. But tragedy is never only about the hero. The hero in tragedy is always situated within the larger tragic action, so that even when the hero dies, the tragic action happens, at least on the stage, but it also happens in real life. Tragedy, of course, is an old, ancient Greek form of theater, but it has been changed so many ways, over the years. And African writers have used it to interpret the African colonial and post-colonial situation. The best known examples would be books like, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, or Wally Soyinka's Death and the King's Horseman, or his adaptation of Euripides' Bacchae of the Euripides, right? Africans have used tragedy. Now, Mandela himself wrote letters to some of his friends insisting, and I didn't know this when I started this work, insisting that the biographies of African leaders, and he was talking here about Luthuli, he was talking about Tambo, he was talking about Seretse Khama, that the biographies of African leaders should be written in the tragic form. And it was amazing, it was exhilarating for me, actually, to find these letters in the archive, right? Having conceptualized him, in that fashion without even knowing that he was a scholar of tragedy. And I also found out that he and his colleagues adapted on Robben Island one of the great books of tragedy, the Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, and he writes about the Greek plays in these letters, and I bring that to the fore of interpreting. And the other thing about tragedy, and I should close on this. The other thing about tragedy, by the way, is that it's often misconceived as a story of defeat, as a story of calamity, because it is always juxtaposed to this nice narrative of romance in romantic narratives. Tragedy is actually a story, as in the story of Jesus, right? Tragedy is a story of resurrection, of death and resurrection. You see it in Steve Biko when he says that his death will become a politicizing thing, right? So when you look at tragedy like that, and Mandela and his fellow revolutionary trialists are very aware that whatever happens to them, even if they receive the death penalty, that tragedy will lead to regeneration and will inspire the people. And so for me, that is the most productive way of looking at Mandela, as an inspiration, but an inspiration who first had to go through this tragic experience. Symbolically, therefore, Mandela stands in a way not as somebody who's apart from Black suffering, but somebody who symbolizes that suffering. And in the second volume of this book, I hope to look at the tragic situation we are now in. So for me, tragedy is a very useful mode of employment of Nelson Mandela. I hope I haven't left anything out, but those are some of the three problematic areas that present biography poses. And it, of course, has to do with race and the writing of history in general. So I'm hoping to use the story of Mandela to pose these larger questions as I've tried to do here today. Thank you.
Hello, thank you, Professor Mangu. I wanted to introduce you. I'm going to introduce you because you are the only keynote speaker here. I did not consult that he's going to speak. I wanted him to come and speak. If we managed to do it in July, he would have been here. I wanted Kolela to speak because for me, when I finished my master's degree in 1999, I was at home. I finished my master's in 1998, so the whole of 1999 I was at home with my parents. My father didn't even finish high school. The only thing I've seen him write is write his name, sign it, Simon Ramupi, and my mother. The whole year with a master's degree from the University of Natal, Devon, the whole year I didn't have a job, but that year I was able to wake up and watch Morning Life, and Kolela was the executive director of the Steve Biko Foundation. I mean, he was young, but he was talking like Biko, you know, Steve Biko, Bantu Biko. And that whole year, he was all over the place. I was able to read Long Walk to Freedom from page 1 to the end that whole year. I think that was preparing me for Robben Island, because at the end of 1999, December, I got a job, Robben Island, I was there. And my story is different because of Robben Island. So, Prof Kolela, thank you so much. I was sad when you went to Washington, D.C. to teach, because, and I can be quoted on that, when you left, the higher education in South Africa became dormant. I will leave it there, but thank you so much. Now we're gonna go to Professor Krista.
No problem. Now I can begin. Shall I begin? Thank you. I want to really thank the organizers of this conference for really putting together. I had the opportunity to listen in yesterday, putting together some excellent panels and excellent conversations, and really for honoring our dear colleague and esteemed colleague, Professor Bob Edgar. I have had the good fortune of being his colleague in the Department of African Studies for over 10 years, for about 15 years before he retired, maybe a little bit less than that. And so it's just a delight and really a testament to his impact and both his intellectual scholarship, but also his mentorship that his students really have put this together. The title of and I'm going to try, I know we're running out of time, so I am going to try and cut some of my paper as well. But the title of my paper is the Howard School and African Studies, Intellectual Recovery and an Insurgent Legacy. And I think many of you are probably aware that in recent weeks, the Department of African Studies at Howard lost another esteemed and just salt of the earth colleague, Professor Mbai Cham, who was chair of African Studies when I was first hired. Bob Edgar was director of graduate studies, and of course, Professor Edgar and Professor Cham had a very close and deep relationship. And I say that to say, I mean, in the department, certainly at Howard, certainly myself, we've been really in a period of mourning, but also, kind of remembrance and reflection. And you really, at that memorial, got the sense of how impactful our colleagues who had been at Howard, who spent really their careers at Howard, who spent 40, 50 years in the Department of African Studies, how impactful they have been. And that's why the loss when Professor Cham passed just, felt so significant, because his imprint on our department had been so great. And Professor Edgar is exactly the same. His imprint on our department has been just extensive. I could say a lot about Professor Edgar as a colleague and as a mentor. For the sake of time, I'm going to, I think, skip through a bunch of that and maybe get to some of the meat of my paper. But I do want to say, when I arrived at Howard, Professor Cham was chair of the department, and Bob was the director of graduate studies. And those of you are probably familiar, our department and program historically has been quite heavily kind of leaning towards graduate studies as opposed to undergraduate studies. So the director of graduate studies was really the co-chair, and really continues to be the co-chair of our department. That's not an insignificant task there. So those two, positions really are very critical in terms of setting the direction and the tone for the entire program and department. When Bob retired, I actually had to step into his shoes and become director of graduate studies. So I am all too familiar with how much responsibility that position entails. But I also took over his research methods course, which I still actually teach today. And I had the pleasure, even before taking over that course, of sitting in on some of Professor Edgar's lectures, and in particular, with the research methods course, I was really struck with how, and I was reminded of this yesterday, listening to his remarks on the biographies that he has done, and even the works that he's working on now. Bob is a historian, and I'm a political scientist, so I don't have quite the same training as he does, I don't have the gift of storytelling as he does. But I recall that I was really quite struck by how, in the research methods course, he, would talk at length about his research excursions, and it was the research methods and research process, but it was really a lot about how to be a good researcher, right? And so you really got a sense, after his lectures, it wasn't simply about how do you conduct surveys, how do you conduct interviews, those kinds of things. But it was really about how do you build lasting relationships? How do you lean into individuals' stories, right? How do you really appreciate and understand the cultural, linguistic, societal context in which your subject is situated. That remains, that continues to have an imprint on me as a professor, as a lecturer in the department, as the convener of our research methods course. for a number of years. I mean, I largely adopted his syllabus, and that's been modified now a little bit, but I really still do try and hold on to, I think, what is really unique about Bob Edgar, but also really about the Howard, mission in terms of not simply not simply teaching, research methods, but understanding and appreciating the role of the researcher in that endeavor and in that process. So Bob and I share, we come from very different disciplines in many ways, but we share several common research interests. I'm a South Africanist. When I first came to Howard, I was actually working on a project which was an encyclopedia of South Africa. And Bob was really instrumental in mentoring me, in helping to edit my work as we were trying to get that project over the finish line. And that was just a tremendous support network that I really had there at Howard, which was unbelievable. We also share an interest in the contributions of African American scholars to the field of African studies. And I was struck yesterday by the conversation and the questions, actually, it's so wonderful that you have so many of your students attending this conference and wanting to learn about the intellectual work of Bob Edgar. But I was also struck at the questions that they were asking about Howard University, right? And also the interactions and engagements between African American scholars and South African scholars. And certainly, I think that is, oh dear, we have a bit of an echo now. That's an important contribution that Professor Edgar, earlier work and even more recent work has really tried to contribute. So again, the title of my paper was, and I'm going to cut it down, was the Howard School in African Studies. I think, again, to make 2 points, I think the points that I really wanted to make is that Professor Edgar has been really instrumental in resurrecting and reclaiming, really, Howard scholars and the role of Howard University in African studies, in the study of Africa, in the legitimation of Africa as a legitimate site of knowledge. He has done that and he has been, I think, instrumental in resurrecting and really kind of continuing what I see as a lineage at Howard University of, approaching and prioritizing Africa, not simply as, kind of a minor subject of study, but a central subject of study and site of knowledge in and of itself. So this concept of the Howard School is credited to Robert Vitalis, who's a political scientist who really as recently as I think it was 2015 or 2016, coined this term or popularized the term the Howard School. And he coined the term, what he called the Howard School of International Relations, and brought that to the attention of the larger academic world, especially my discipline of political science. So Vitalis situates these scholars, who were largely based at Howard University, within the nascent field of international relations that at that time centered race as a foundational principle, but largely ignored Africa as an object of study or part of the international system. So Vitalis' Howard School of IR is but one facet, I would argue, of a broader academic thought that flourished at Howard University between the 1930s through the 1950s, and is first discussed in Charles Henry's biography. It's an article. He's a biographer of Ralph Bunche, but he wrote a 2004 article, A World View of Race Revisited, where he too kind of introduces this idea of the Howard School. But as you'll see later in my paper, it was really actually Bob Edgar's 1992 work on Ralph Bunche, which introduces or certainly kind of revisits and really kind of resurrects this this Africanist lens and the use of field studies in Africa, in South Africa, East Africa in particular, that African American scholars used to really develop broader global and international theories around race, imperialism, and empire at that particular time. So what was unique to Howard at this time in the 1930s through 1950s were the connections that were made between the international realm and the Black world, or the Africana world. For them, the Black experience in Africa and the diaspora was best understood as part of a broader transnational processes and phenomena shaped by the interplay of structures of globalized and racialized capitalism. This was mentioned yesterday. I think one of the our other colleagues talked about the transnational scholarship and how Edgar's work really was kind of pioneering in that regard. And so what I'm arguing is that Edgar's work needs to be seen as a continuation of a long lineage of Howard scholars who actually engaged in these kind of transnational theorizing of race, empire, and imperialism in the world. Less tethered to the rigid disciplines, and in some respects shielded by their segregation in the Black Academy and before the pressures of the Cold War, this intellectual community at Howard built an insurgent research and scholarly agenda that encompassed the global Black experience and was rooted in the study of an active engagement with Africa. It was also mentioned, I think Professor Edgar mentioned yesterday, and someone asked about the African Studies Association, whether or not it was integrated or representative of African voices more. People may be familiar in 2018, the presidential address given by Jean Ullman. She gave a presidential address that acknowledged the older and competing tradition of Black scholarship in African studies, centered especially at Howard University in the 1920s and 30s. She recounts the history of the African Studies Association and describes the processes whereby white American scholars became the anointed gatekeepers and experts in a hierarchical and racialized landscape of knowledge production about Africa, while their Black counterparts were marginalized and displaced as massive funding to post-war Africa area studies was funneled overwhelmingly to traditional white institutions. So in my remarks, I wanted to, revisit this foundational African diasporan intellectual community, and will argue that the import of Africa for the Howard School was not just as a subject of study, but as a legitimate epistemic site of knowledge and a frame or lens through which to study race, imperialism, and white supremacy as global problems and in broad and relational terms. I'm cutting a few things here, so I'm probably not going to get to all of this, but I think 2 points that I wanted to make, or that are made in the paper, is to highlight 2 elements unique to these scholars, the Howard scholars at the time, and formative in shaping the trajectory of African studies at Howard. I argue, as part of a larger effort to confront the coloniality of knowledge and forge an academic and activist decolonial agenda, the Howard scholars established an institutional architecture and academic spaces and of knowledge production that were unique in the American Academy in their organization, mission, vision, and methods of research, and played a vital role in sustaining critiques and alternatives to mainstream thinking on race and imperialism. Secondly, I will highlight the unique ties the Howard scholars forged with anti-colonial practitioners and liberation activities and theoreticians, and the future leaders of independent Africa and the Caribbean nations. I won't be able to get to all of that, but hopefully, just to preface, that's what I would have liked to have done. So I don't want to go too far back in terms of Howard's history, but I thought, again, that people might be interested to know when Howard was founded in 1867, there was no provision in the charter or the founding of the university to teach blacks about themselves. It's a historically black college and university, so it had some mandates, but the mandate was not to teach blacks about themselves. And in fact, the early history of Howard really points to an ambivalent relationship that the university had, or the institution as a whole had, to the study of the black experience. It was both a national leader in the study of the black experience. It boasted one of the largest faculties in the field. But institutionally, Howard was more, at this time of its founding, in the first 40 decades, or sorry, 4 decades, maybe 40 years, Howard was more interested in advancing its role in education, in educating and training black leadership, more than institutionally establishing itself organically as the leading authority on the study of the global black experience. And you see this in a number of instances. As early as 1901, Kelly Miller, who was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences and professor of sociology at Howard, proposed that the university support the studies of the American Negro Academy, an idea that was swiftly rejected by the all-white Board of Trustees. In 1916, Miller, now joined by Alain Locke, who is a philosophy professor at Howard University, led an abortive effort to develop curricula on the global black experience. That was unsuccessful. Around 1920, Charles Wesley offered a course on European expansion in Africa, and the following year, William Leo Hansberry taught 2 courses on ancient civilizations, focusing on Africa and reflecting the earliest efforts to institutionalize the teaching of Africa and people of African descent. So it was Alain Locke really who had a larger vision and conviction that a relational approach to the study of race and race relations was necessary, and that the fate of African Americans and race relations in the United States was tied to international policies around the future of African peoples and dependent territories. To this end, in 1924, Locke submitted his first proposal to Howard's Board of Trustees to create an Institute of African Studies. His proposal was not only rejected, but Locke was dismissed from Howard, in part for even proposing such an institute. When he was rehired by President Johnson, he submitted a new memorandum for a Department of African Studies in 1928. This too was rejected. In his memorandum, he laid out an interdisciplinary structure for the department with courses taught across the social sciences. And those of you who are, of course, alums of our program know that our department is indeed interdisciplinary. So I don't want to go in too much to the history, but moving to the period of the 1930s and 1940s, this was really described as the golden age of scholarship, because a remarkable pool of tremendous talent came to be concentrated on just a few black campuses, with, at that time, Howard, kind of being central. Howard boasted by far the largest concentration of black PhDs anywhere in the United States and the world, thanks in large part to the leadership of the university's first president, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who was appointed president in 1926. One of Johnson's first and perhaps smartest actions as president was to rehire Alain Locke, setting the stage for Howard to become the leading center of black scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. Locke was a Harvard PhD in philosophy and a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. He was instrumental in bringing together the network of scholars to theorize race on a global scale. Locke himself assembled an extensive intellectual network of his own, which included his Oxford peer, South African Pixley Seme, among many other young Africans that he continued to intellectually collaborate with and correspond with. In 1928, Locke and his Howard colleagues hired the 25-year-old Ralph Bunche to teach political science. He had an MA in political theory from Harvard and went on to receive his PhD from Harvard in 1934 with a specialization in comparative colonial administration. I'll say more about Bunche a little bit later. Bunche went on to forge close ties with Howard faculty member E. Franklin Frazier, who received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1931 in sociology. Together, they lured Trinidadian-born Eric Williams to join the political science department. Williams, who received his DPhil from Oxford University in 1938, revised his dissertation into the seminal book Capitalism and Slavery, which was published in 1944. There was also Marxist Abraham Harris, Professor Abraham Harris, who was an economist who arrived at Howard in 1927. His PhD was from Columbia University. In the history department, you had Rayford Logan, who received his PhD from Harvard in 1936. He joined the faculty in 1938. And then last but not least, you had Mers Tate, who was also a diplomatic historian, received her PhD, her doctorate in international relations from Radcliffe College in 1941. She joined Howard's history department right after her graduation in 1942. So there was quite a unique and cosmopolitan environment that really emerged at Howard at this time. I'm trying to skip over a bunch of things now. Sorry, so I don't want to say very much about that. I can't go into too much detail, but the scholarship and what really emerged, from Howard scholars at that time was unique in their efforts to link knowledge and knowledge production, social responsibility, and collective struggle. They were unique among their generation of professors for the relationships they forged with liberation activists and theoreticians and the future leaders of independent Africa and Caribbean nations. Howard scholars shared with their anti-colonial nationalist collaborators an understanding that the international system was founded on and characterized by racial hierarchy, and that national self-determination was interconnected with global equality. As Adam Getachew writes in her book on world-making, empire, and anti-colonial thought, the experience of colonial domination and international hierarchy gave distinctive shape to debates about sovereignty and state formation among a network of Black Atlantic world makers. Getachew notes that many of these debates took place on the campus of Howard University. Howard's campus was the site of numerous conferences, workshops, and debates that sought to hash out the multiple political imaginaries that could form the basis of a more inclusive internationalism. These Black thinkers developed visions to accommodate not only states, but also federations, regional unions, transnational communities, and international organizations. Unfortunately, I don't have time to kind of go into some of the details of the conferences that were organized, or the institutional kind of scaffolding, really, that Howard scholars erected through things such as the Journal of Negro Education, through conference series, annual yearbooks, and other publications. I'm going to skip over all of that because I want to make the connections for you to Bob Edgar. Sorry, I'm just trying to kind of go through. I mean, what's interesting is it's refreshing that much of this scholarship and much of this activism that occurred on Howard's campus is being resurrected now, through the work of Vitalis, through the work of Errol Henderson, through the work of Pearl Robinson, through the work of Adam Getachew and others. What I want to, kind of argue and make clear is one of the, I think, arguments or questions, I guess, that Vitalis, I guess, ended his study with, is to say that, well, who were the heirs of the Howard School? I want to make clear the heirs of the Howard School are Joseph Harris, who's a historian at Howard University. Yesterday, Bob Edgar mentioned Ron Walters, who's a political scientist who was at Howard for a while. Ayodele Langley, Leon Demas, Suleiman Yang, all professors in the Department of African Studies, carried on this lineage, right, that had begun at Howard really almost from its inception, or certainly from the early 1900s. I would add to this list, certainly today, Professors Mbai Cham and Professor Robert Edgar. So to quickly turn, I wanted to highlight in particular the earlier work of Bob Edgar, his book published in African American in South Africa, The Travel Notes of Ralph Bunche, which was published in 1992. So Bob Edgar and Ralph Bunche actually share a few things in common, and Edgar in some ways followed in the intellectual footsteps of Ralph Bunche. Bunche was an outstanding undergraduate at UCLA in the 1920s and one of the most acclaimed UCLA alumni. In 1928, he started his first and only faculty position at Howard University, where he established and chaired Howard's first Department of Political Science. While there have been numerous biographies and scholarly works written about Bunche over the years, Edgar's was the first to position, am I running out of time? I hope not. Edgar's was the first to position Bunche as an Africanist and to capture his pioneering contributions to the study of Africa. Bunche, a Nobel Prize winner for his role in mediating the conflict in the Middle East, has been most revered as a major world statesman and African-American intellectual turned policymaker on the global stage. But Bunche's formative intellectual training was in African studies. He completed his MA and PhD at Harvard, and on the role of race and imperialism in European colonization of African territories. What Edgar presents in his 1992 book is the travel notes of Ralph Bunche's 1937 and 38 field trips to South Africa. This research was part of a larger project Bunche embarked on to receive intensive training in anthropological methods that took him to Europe, Southern and Eastern Africa, and Indonesia. This trip was unique in the magnitude of funding Bunche was able to secure and unprecedented for Black scholars at the time. Bunche would be the only Black scholar to receive private foundation funding to conduct research in Africa until the 1950s. Bob Edgar masterfully situates Bunche's travel notes in both South Africa, the South African climate and context at the time, as well as the U.S. racial context and global context at the time that Bunche himself was navigating. Bunche's visit coincided with the Herzog administration in South Africa that notably set a ceiling, and the Herzog bills that set a ceiling on the amount of lands that Africans could eventually occupy, and eliminated the Cape African vote from the only enfranchised group of Africans in the country. I'm seeing Nail, so I'm going to start skipping even more things. Fascinating work there. I want to say that Edgar brings Bunche's research findings and unique perspectives on segregated South Africa to the public realm. His field trip coincided with the earlier period of his career in which political views veered to the left. Bunche saw colonialism in Africa as manipulating race as an instrument of domination and exploitation, and the imperialist state protecting and promoting capitalist interests overseas. So there's more to say about that, but I also want to tie this to Edgar's even more recent work and article with Myra Hauser, which was a 2016 article that they wrote, which unearthed a forgotten encounter between Jan Smuts and African-American leaders at Howard University in 1930. He talks about this as a pivotal meeting that galvanized African American opposition to white rule in South Africa. So in 1930, Jan Smuts was one of the most prominent international statesmen at the time. He toured the United States to promote the principles of the League of Nations. And before coming to Howard University to speak at a conference with African American leaders, Smuts gave a speech in New York where he called on African Americans to demonstrate patience in their own country's Jim Crow laws and contrasted them, African Americans, with continental Africans, which he described as, quote, docile animals, the most patient of animals, next to the ass. So the conference that Smuts attended at Howard was sponsored by Phelps Stokes Fund and was intended as a discussion on the Black condition in the United States between both Black and white scholars and policymakers. But Smuts' racist remarks that he made in New York angered many African American leaders and overshadowed the Howard Conference. So what was interesting, and at that time in 1930, Howard boasted 150 faculty and roughly 2,500 students. So about 1/6 of all Black students attending college in the United States. And the campus served as a convening space for many African diaspora leaders. So Edgar, is equally concerned with reclaiming the place of Howard University and the group or cohort of African American leaders who challenged Smuts and offered an alternative framework of internationalism to counter the imperialism emanating from the League of Nations. His article exposed how white leaders projected, protected, and politically deployed whiteness as an international norm, much as Bunch and his contemporaries had done decades ago. But Bob also centers Howard as a site of opposition and intellectual critique of this agenda, and his role would continue, and this role would continue into the present. So to conclude, I just want to quickly conclude with one remark. Bob, when I emailed Pearl Robinson and said, "Oh, we're having this conference, chime in," she wrote back and she said, quote, "I consider Bob Edgar to be one of Howard's treasures, and that indeed is so the truth. And you will know that she there in that statement, and I here in my statement, I'm acknowledging the extraordinary intellectual contributions of Professor Edgar, but as well as his, situating him in this long lineage, intellectual lineage that has existed at Howard since really the 1920s and 1930s. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Johnson, Krista. Thank you so much. Professor Nakhla Hussein, are you there? The Egyptian queen? Are you there? Tando, is she there? Okay. Nakhla.
Yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Professor Edgar is smiling. So the floor is yours.
Oh, first I wanted to thank Professor Krista Johnson for this amazing, to follow the amazing presentation about Dr. Edgar's scholarship. And I echo what you mentioned, and to include to it, adding how Professor Edgar added to the field of African studies including African American scholarship, but also my story is kind of add to this because I come from an Arab Middle Eastern background, and knowing Dr. Edgar I was a student, and as a mentor, the graduate director at Howard at the African Studies. So I know him throughout my journey in the African studies. So I always feel, and I tell Bob this, I am grateful uh, for everything that I have now, because of that moment when I stepped into his office and decided to talk to him about my options of being somebody who's interested in the Nubian Egyptian plight. Would I have a space in the African studies, since it's very often concentrated the study of Egypt as a Middle Eastern, within the Middle Eastern discipline, but not into the African studies. And he welcomed me and encouraged me and supported me so much. And that's to give my story is for the students who are in this conference. I wanted to thank NEO for this amazing put together conference and organization of the talks and the panels, and giving us a platform how to express how deeply grateful for a person who touched, influenced so many people. And as I said, you've talked to my little one today, but if I haven't been to Howard University, I wouldn't have met my husband, or, I wouldn't have been right now in my current job, which I am Arabic professor at George Mason. But I also, what I learned from Professor Edgar had actually paid a lot in bringing my training in African studies to George Mason University, where there is not, you can tell from the modern and classical languages in George Mason, we don't have any African language that is taught, and we except Arabic, if you consider Arabic as an African language. But we also don't have Africanists, except, I could say it's only me and another professor. So that adds to the legacy of African studies, Howard University, and also what Dr. Edgar has also impacted my life, and I'm sure he impacted so many students. With this, I wanted to say just thank you so much for putting this together and for giving us a chance to express how grateful we are. And I'm also I haven't finalized my paper, but I'm also the activism of Professor Edgar in South Africa had inspired me to also look at how South Africa is how Professor Edgar and his scholarship, but also like in South Africa, has also inspired me to look into the South African solidarity with the Palestinian cause right now. So I hope that paper will be finalized soon. But in adding on all of his scholarship, his life is inspirational to many students, and including me. So thank you so much. And with this, I'll stop right here.
Hello. Thanks, the Egyptian queen. You didn't say you are the one who started this job for me. You should have started with that and say, I gave Neo a job. When you go back to South Africa, you must organize this conference. So, Professor Nakhla, I have a team here. I have two teams, international organizing committee that includes you, Professor Ben Katten there, who's teaching with you at George Mason University, and Professor Noor Nohadin, professor at Wits University. Those have been meeting me in Joburg and discussing everything. They are not here, but they are a big part of this conference, and I have a local organizing committee here. My boss is the one who was talking to you, is my PhD student, so I don't know how I can be my boss when I need to pass him. But he's been running amok, telling me that I mustn't sleep. And I also have Erin Frey-Smith, our colleague from Howard. She came, she flew in. She's our finance minister, she's been telling me, now, how much do you need today? Okay, I will give it to you, or I don't think we have that much, So Erin, thanks for coming. I have the entire, my PhD, my master's, and a few honor students who are here, who are helping. I must say, ladies and gentlemen, we did not have funding for this conference. And if I become a president, I'm going to make sure that conferences like this, they get funding, because we have a mess now in the Madlala Commission. I mean, if we're academics, why can't we talk about these things? Look at the mess at Fort Hare, right? I mean, it's crazy. Anyway, Tando, I don't know what's the procedure now, but if you want to comment on Professor Mangu's Mandela biography, I've been asking him for a long time, when is it coming out? And then he said I must stop asking him, but I saw last time I emailed him, he said it's coming out in December. So I'm looking forward to read that. If there's anyone who wants to comment on Professor, I mean, he's the only South African keynote speaker, right, an academic. So I know there are a lot of South African academics who have problems with him. I don't have problems with him. He's the professor I wanted to be before I met Professor Edgar, but now I need to merge Professor Edgar activism and scholarship with Manu, what he has done in South Africa. And it's part of the reason that some of us, we don't get jobs in the South African University, because we are trying to be like Professor Xolela Manu. But the struggle continues. Aluta.
Thank you very much. You're supposed to thank the keynote speakers so that we go to the next session.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Krista. Thank you so much. I miss Howard. I always say that Howard was built in 1867. I was born in 1967. It was built 100 years before me, so that they can prepare for me, so that I can get there.
Thank you very much. Can we give them a round of applause? The Buffalo Soldier is reminiscing with his comrades. Thank you for that. They are comrades now. Colleagues and friends, we are running really behind schedule. The next session is going to be chaired by Dr. Laszlo from the Department of History at UFS. We've got one online presentation, and that is Sister Anne Mager. That is the only person that is online. But the doc is going to take over the session, and we proceed accordingly. Thank you very much. If you want tea, you want cool drink, water, you can step outside and go and help yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Tono Wetu. And thank you, everybody, for being here. This session is on archives and methodologies. A lot of the discussions today have been mentioning the value of sources, reflections on methodologies, discussions about how to use sources to construct our history. So I think this is a very useful session, and we have some people from different types of backgrounds talking about archives methodologies here. I don't want to waste more time, seeing that we're running behind. Can all speakers come to the front, please? All right. Atli Zeowani, are you here? I know I saw Tabang earlier, but I don't know where he went to. He stepped out. Okay.
Okay. Maybe we should proceed. We start with N because N is online.
Okay, Anne, thank you for presenting today. Anne Major will be presenting her paper, The Making of the Archive on the Banned Persons Memory Project, African Studies Collection at UCT. So you'll have Tandilweto 15 minutes. Is that the new? Okay, 15 minutes to present. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to Neo, to Tandilweto, to Bob, and to all the hardworking organizers for this opportunity to honor Bob Edgar's life and to be part of this conference. Quite amazing. Okay, I wanted to just also say that Bob Edgar's his intellectual generosity, his personal encouragement, and his exemplary decency have been a huge influence, pardon my emotion, on my life for the past, 30 years or so. But I also thank you very much for this opportunity to introduce to you the archive of the Banned Persons Memory Project. This archive remains untouched. It's about to be launched in the next week or so, and it awaits scholars' attention. This is a great opportunity for young scholars, particularly, to get stuck into some research. Now, to start with, Bob Edgar's wonderful short biography of Josie Mpama, I must hold it up. If you haven't read it, please do. Provides a succinct account of the purpose that banning served in the arsenal of the apartheid regime. It was used to prevent individuals from playing an active role in politics and in society and in general. Josie Mpama was banned because she'd taken a leading part in protests in the Congress movement in the mid-1950s, and particularly in the run-up to that historic Women's March on Pretoria. And her banning order is on page 147 in the Josie Mpama biography, spells out the sections of the Suppression of Communism Act 44 of 1950, a piece of Cold War legislation to hark back to other presentations, under which she was banned. Banning did not silence Josie, but it did restrict her. Now, we've just seen coming up as a PowerPoint slide is an example of a banning order. I'm not going to go through it in any great detail, but this banning order was that which was served on Debbie Budlander, who was one of the interviewers for the Banned Persons Memory Project. And Debbie was banned in 1981. She was banned from entering any Bantu area, any colored township, any educational institution, any court of law. And she was banned from communicating with any other banned person or banned organization, and with communicating with more than one other person at any one time. And the details of these banning orders, this is just one example, go on for pages, 6 pages at a time. And hers is clearly tailored towards her perceived role as a white student at the university at the time. But others received different sorts of banning orders. They couldn't go to factories, they couldn't go to industrial areas, and so on. So the interesting thing, if you just scroll on all the way to, it's probably not very clear to read, but there's 6 pages of detail, followed by a second correspondence with the security police, to whom Debbie had to apply in order to get married. And the security police lifted her banning order for a couple of hours so that she could get married to another banned person. And then there's a third piece of communication with the security branch. And this time it was for the security branch to declare her master's thesis an undesirable publication and to forbid it from ever being published. And this, of course, they confirmed that this was a piece of Marxism. And in Debbie's wry humor, she has said, Well, they just didn't understand Palensis. So clearly this banning orders were tailored in part to suit particular individuals or the perception of particular individuals, but they were also generic in some ways across the 1,400 bannings that occurred between 1950 and 1985. Now, banning stopped in 1985, not because the apartheid regime didn't want to ban people anymore or didn't want to restrict people anymore, but because they found incarceration and detention in particular a more effective way of silencing people. But even that, of course, backfired. Okay, so the Banned Persons Memory Project was initiated by Eric Abraham, who was himself banned, and led by Paula Ensor, who was also banned. And then there was a team of us who were brought in as interviewers and to help with the compilation of the archive. A whole host of us, including Debbie and Paula and others, and I think Luyanda Kamsumza in the conference there was part of that wider team of finding people, identifying people, and finding out if they would be if they were willing to be interviewed. We identified 200 people from the government gazettes who had been banned and who were still alive. We approached all 200. 182 agreed to be interviewed. So there are 182 interviews in this Banned Persons Memory Project. Now, in order to find out who'd been banned, we went to the government gazettes. At that stage, UCT Library hadn't burnt down, and so we were able to use them there. And we compiled vast spreadsheets, printed out. They make a couple of tomes of printed paper listing the individuals who were banned, where they were living, the various details and so on. And we used those as a starting point to try and track down individuals. Now, clearly individuals banned in the 1950s are no longer living where they were banned, and in many cases they're no longer living at all. But we had to track down through various networks who were still around. Okay, so what is the value of this project? Now, clearly, in the mind of Eric Abraham and Paula, who started the project, that they believed very much that banning had been overlooked as a form of restriction, as an apartheid tool of oppression, and that particularly the lasting effects on individuals had also been largely neglected by researchers. And so the point of these interviews was to gather the stories of people who'd been banned, not only about the period of their banning, but the period that led up to it, and indeed their childhood, that might have led in some way to some conscientization, to some activism, and so on. So the archive provides fascinating stories of individuals and their experience of life under apartheid. Some of these are well known, but most of them are not well known. They cut across all sorts of divides, race, class, and so on, and they form, I think, a very valuable source. And in many instances, there's still an opportunity to follow up on this work that we started, so that people can, who are still alive, can talk about their experiences in more detail. Our interviews were roughly an hour or so each. That's really only scratching the surface very, very lightly. We distinguish between banning and banishment. Banning meant people were banned where they lived or where the state decided was their permanent home, and people who were banished were sent far away from home, where they were unknown, where they were outsiders. and they were banned there. So they were restricted in that faraway place. So they were banished, and people who were banned were restricted where they were living. Okay, so what does the archive comprise? Apart from these 182 interviews, each of which has a film component, a visual component, except for a few where we couldn't film. We were very much interfered with by COVID, I'm afraid. We had intended to travel across the country to decenter much of the interviewing work, but COVID meant that we had to stay put in our houses and interview through Zoom, and so the project became more centralized than it would have been had there not been COVID, and more people would have been drawn into to facilitate and help with the interviewing. So there's a visual component, there's an oral component. Every interview has a transcription, and there's a short bio on each person interviewed. So isn't that a great start for a researcher to have that little clutch of materials to start with? Okay, so all right, we also provide notes on how we went about things. We provided a list of the interviews, a list of the questions we asked, but of course the list is a very crude beginning. It's not the questions that were actually asked in many instances. And Paula Ensor has written a comprehensive introduction to the collection where she sets out the apartheid regime's deployment of the term communist in great detail, because all these bannings occurred under the Suppression of Communism Act, and she also lists the various amendments that were made to the banning legislation. Now, I know that we're short of time, so I'm going to skip at this point. Well, perhaps I should just say two things. The archive, it was intended that the archive would have been posted already on the UCT's Ibali portal, but they have delayed, and it will be available probably only at the end of the month. But in the meantime, researchers who are interested in accessing this material can ask Andrea Walker for assistance. And I'm going to just hold this up so that you've got this on screen. I only got this information yesterday. So Andrea Walker at uct.ac.za, Andrea.Walker at uct.ac.za can assist immediately. If you want to get going on this, get going. There's the UCT Library's Ibali portal will have it up soon. Okay, so I've got snippets from 2 interviews here, just 2 interviews, and only tiny little snippets. This is a teaser. This is not in any way a paper. We've not attempted to analyze. We've not attempted to work with this material. We're presenting it as an archive and hope that young researchers will get stuck in and do the hard graft. Okay, so I start with Tenjiwe Mtinso. She's a well-known ANC activist, and she was one-time Minister of Defense. She's been a member of Parliament and so on. And she tells a story not only of banning and of imprisonment and of torture and pain, but she tells the story of a gender and political awakening. And I tell her story because I think it talks to resilience, extraordinary resilience, and the resilience that is, it begins when she's a little girl. It doesn't happen only when she's a hardened activist. It begins when she's a little girl. And I'm going to recount a couple of snippets that I think illustrate this. So as a 12-year-old child, Tenji was given a severe beating by her mother for asking who of the kids in their household were her biological brothers and sisters. Now, mother was furious with her, beat her, and said, "You never ask that question again. They are all your brothers and sisters." And not long after this, they were all sent off to live with an aunt in a small village. And what happened in that village very soon after they arrived is what remains in Tenjiwa's mind as the second most vivid childhood memory after the beating from her mom. And she says, okay, so from Mbozolo, the village where they were living, she was living with an aunt. But then my aunt lost her husband. The year must have been 1964 or thereabouts, maybe 1962. We lived in Mbozolo in a little homestead with about 3 rondavels and 1 4-cornered house. We were sleeping one night and then the rondavels were burning down. So we ran and we left the place without anything except what we had been sleeping in, which was absolutely nothing. It was just underwear. And later we moved across to another village about 15 kilometers from where we were. And this was Kwamanyateza village, where my grandmother from this aunt, allowed us to stay with her. And then we heard, or I heard, that we had been kicked out. Our house had been burned down, or our homestead had been burnt down because my aunt was a witch. Then our aunt sat us down. I must have been about 12 or so. And she told us that in fact she was not a witch. What had happened was that when my uncle died, my Oompi, who was my older uncle, said that she should marry him, which was called Ukungenwa. She should be engenad by this uncle. Now this uncle, one, I'd never seen him quite sober, and my aunt also said that she'd never experienced him as a sober person. I'd never seen him work, and as far as my aunt was concerned, he was a useless person. That was one vivid story. And the second thing my aunt said was that she never loved him, even as a brother-in-law. She never cared for him, and there was no way that she was going to wake up one day and get married to him. Thirdly, she did not understand why she should marry anybody for that matter. So she was resisting, and for that her homestead was burnt down. That was my first experience of what I would understand later on as the intersection of gender and the problems of class and also race. At that time I didn't understand it, but later I was to get that kind of interpretation. What stayed with me was the abuse of so-called culture, because it was said that it was cultural, that if you lose a husband, then you get engenad by that man. So, quite an extraordinary story. 20 years later, fast forward, Tenjiwa has been in prison. Okay, she is now banned, and she says, now the conditions of my banning order was that I could not leave a prescribed area, which was Soweto and Johannesburg. And I couldn't work. It was, oh, I'll skip. Okay, so the banning was dreadful. Of course, banning was a terrible thing. That thing of not being able to socialize, not being able to go and find a job, not being able to write as you'd want to write. By this time, I was an activist, not being able to address meetings, not being able to attend meetings. And you'd have to really go. People would have to arrange meetings in certain places just for you to interact with them. So your views could be heard by them. You'd have to risk the lives of others because you also wanted to participate. But, she says, comrades of that time were prepared and ready to accommodate the fact that they should also be an activist. So this theme of resilience is the one I've explored for these couple of minutes. I'm not going to have time to bring you the story of Ike's Morwe, but I urge you to read it. The story of Ike's Morwe. Ike's was a journalist working for the Friend newspaper in Bloemfontein. He was banned and banished to Bethlehem and had a period of detention in Modabi prison. An extraordinary story, a really powerful story, and one close to the Free State stories that we've been hearing about earlier, but quite significant, quite important. Okay, and finally, I will just say that these are I have chosen quite militant stories of resilience, of how individuals were sustained by the struggle and sustained the struggle in turn. But they're also stories of loneliness and isolation and pain and suffering, as much as they are of resilience and getting on with life. The Banned Persons Memory Project provides a wide range of narratives of this experience, told in the words of the interviewers, of those interviewed themselves in response to our questions. And of course, as Bob found with the life of Josie Mpama, these stories are about, one half sentence. Personal experience is very often a story of a bigger organization. Josie's story morphed into the story of the Communist Party, and you will find that opportunity exists in many of these interviews. I hope that you'll find the source useful, that you will encourage your students to make use of the archive. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Major. I think this is a very useful archive, and I know many people will make use of it, and especially for filling in those histories of smaller towns, it might be actually helpful. We will follow the order of the program. I don't know, is Atle Zeowoni here? No, okay, all right. Then. Next up is Aaron Frey-Smith, who will be talking to us about the Library of Congress the Library of Congress and collections. So please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Seems like most of the students are probably out still getting tea, but that's okay. This is actually a nice full circle moment for me. The very first conference presentation I ever gave was in front of Professor Edgar, and it was quite possibly the most painful experience I've ever had in my life. I was completely and totally unprepared. I'd flown all the way to South Africa with some half-baked idea of what I wanted to present. I was on a panel with PhD students from Oxford and Cambridge. I was a master's student. And all you said was, well, that was trial by fire. And then we went off and had a fantastic day. So hopefully I've gotten a little bit better in the last 21 years, but remains to be seen. So when Neo asked me to present on the Library of Congress, he didn't really give me too much about what he wanted me to present on. So I just have a general framework. So I'm going to generally talk about the Library of Congress and our history, particularly our history with regards to area studies, what some of our strengths are in our collections, how to access them, and then wrap it all up by talking about what my field of librarianship, particularly area studies librarianship, are grappling with right now. So the Library of Congress, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. It was founded in 1800 to service the Congress, but something very, very important happened in 1813. And that was the British burned it to the ground. And that was extremely important for the library, and more specifically, it's very important for me and everyone in this room, because when the British burned it, we changed our mission. It went from what does Congress need to write laws to Thomas Jefferson, who desperately needed money, sold them his personal library on the premise that there is no topic upon which Congress does not have need to reference. Therefore, it opened up our collection possibilities to not just law and legislation and policy, but also to religion. There were several copies of the Quran in that collection, and we still have the full collection today that's on display if anyone gets to DC. But that was an extremely pivotal moment for us, and we still call back to that change in mission today. So the mission of the Library of Congress is to collect a representative sample of all human history, scholarship, and culture from around the world. That's an extremely large mission. We're the only library in the world that has such a large mandate. At one point, we had a reputation for being the library of last resort. If you can't find the book or the piece or the government document, you could go to the Library of Congress and you'd be able to find it there. I'm not sure that's as true today. We started our more regional focus with the opening of the Hispanic Reading Room in 1939, followed by the American Folklife Center in 1976, and more importantly to all of you, the African and Middle Eastern Division in 1978, to address new interests around the world and to gain an expertise into the areas in which they were collecting. Prior to that moment, in 1978, our collections were extremely Eurocentric, but they continue to be a little bit. We also have 5 overseas offices around the world in places where it's difficult to acquire materials. On the African continent, we have one, well, semi-African. We have one in Nairobi, Kenya. We have one in Cairo, so that's pseudo-Africa. We have Jakarta, Rio de Janeiro, and the last one escapes me, New Delhi. So the mission of collecting a representative sample that is across all format types, and that's across all languages and all scripts. And one of our more recent pushes that I have been a big supporter of is to collect more African languages, and in particular African scripts. We hosted a conference last year where we had the founders, or the people who created the Inco language script. They came and spoke to all of us about how they created that. A couple highlights of our collection, some of our flashier items, is the Omar Ibn Said collection. This one is very close to my heart because it's one that I actually acquired in my first year at the library. It is the only known slave manuscript written entirely in Arabic, and it is fully digitized and available online at www.loc.gov. We also have a Bamoun map collection, which is it's an extremely rare collection of maps that are written in the Bamoun script. We also have, in the African division, we have a postcard collection, poster collection, an Ethiopian religious collection, and just recently we have digitized, not microfiched, all of our Ethiopian newspapers, which have runs all the way back to the early 20th century. I think the real strength of our collection is our more mundane collections, the things that don't gather as much attention, that administration aren't as interested in, but are the most important to us as scholars. And that is our academic journals collection and our newspaper collection. I know that Bob has been to our newspaper collection in our serials reading room many, many times. But we have full runs of 12 South African newspapers, including Alangalase Natal and Afrikaans newspapers and newspapers from all over the country. Our African academic journals are also an extremely important collection, and I'm going to talk specifically about them because I have been working for the last 5 years to get them digitized. Our academic journal collection is one of the largest in the world. In particular, we have thousands of titles, particularly from Nigeria and South Africa, that are some of the finest examples of local history and local studies. We've been trying for the last few years to figure out a way to digitize the table of contents, because one of the biggest limitations for us as an American institution is that it's very difficult to get to us. And if you're going through a collection that is not fully cataloged, it's only cataloged at the title level, you don't know how long you need and you don't know exactly what to order. So the project that we started about 5 years ago is the African Academic Digital Journal project, I believe. And so we are trying to digitize every table of content so that before you come to the library, you'll be able to look and identify exactly what you're looking for before you get there. And you could potentially go to a little button on our main screen that is called Ask a Librarian, and you can actually ask for any journal articles to be scanned and sent to your inbox. And that is a great way to get around copyright. So one of the limitations that we are up against with regards to access is that we are not immune to the staffing shortages that are hitting all academic institutions, and with staffing shortages means you have to take on a lot more jobs, and we are losing our knowledge of individual languages and subject specializations. Sorry, let me talk more about the collection just quick. In order to get into these collections, another important one, Neo was supposed to remind me, is the pamphlet collection. The pamphlet collection is something that African librarians from the Library of Congress have been collecting since the 1960s. These are pieces that are not individually cataloged, but they're things that were picked up from around the continent. They include conference proceedings from 1960s and 1970s from all over Africa, and pamphlets that are just far too small to catalog individually. They're all organized by country and in some cases by subject. So in order to access these, there's quite a few things that are available online. We have several catalogs that you can peruse if you go to our website. The prints and photographs have a separate catalog, geography and maps, the main one, and then we also have an online journals catalog as well. Those things that are for on-site only access are things like the physical collections and any of our copyright protected material. We launched a new website called Stacks about 3 years ago, and that is where we are digitizing all of our newspapers, our entire newspaper collection. But unfortunately, it is only available on site because of copyright restriction. So the best way to get in touch is to go on our website and click the Ask a Librarian button. With that, you can be in touch with any of our experts around the library, and they can point you in the direction that you need, and they are allowed to copy for free up to 20 pages of scanned materials. Okay, so along with access is what we are grappling with as a field. I'm not sure how many people are interested in library sciences, but I do think that it's extremely relevant to this larger community that we're in. One of the big ones is, how do we not just extract, but give back to the places in which we are taking the material from? One way to do that is digitization, but I wanted to give two specific examples where this has been extremely powerful for us. There's a book called The Badass Librarians of Timbuktu, and that profiles, it actually talks about the Library of Congress, where we were called in to, as Al-Qaeda was coming to burn down a library, we came in, secreted it off to our New Delhi offsite facility, and digitized the full collection. Another pretty interesting example is the Constitution of Afghanistan. When Al-Qaeda took over Afghanistan, someone from the Library of Congress went over and got a copy of their Constitution. I don't want to make a political statement, but when they were able to have a Constitution again, they couldn't find a copy of their Constitution, and luckily we had a copy in our stacks, so we were able to digitize it and send it back. We don't know where that copy is today, unfortunately. The other issue is digitization, how much money is needed in order to do that. I think one good thing about being such a large institution is that our head of preservation about 5 years ago made the decision that all newspapers, all things would be digitized as opposed to microfiching. The majority of institutions, even in the US, are still microfiching their collections. Anyone who has spent any time in a collection that has been 100% microfished understands the pain of your eyes bleeding in the dark room trying to go through those. Sorry, I already said that one. And then another big issue is the cost of publication. which leads into the conversation about open access, which is a conversation that I would love to have with all of you after this, since that's a very big thought. Taking it back, my final thought, though, is that with our staffing shortages, we have less expertise to be able to process the collections in a responsible way, and we don't have the expertise to be able to catalog things in a good way. Taking it back to the overall themes that we've heard throughout this conference of collaboration, community, nothing is gained from being a scholar in isolation. We are entirely reliant upon you to use our materials. You are reliant upon us to preserve those materials. And increasingly, we are more reliant upon each other to justify our roles, justify the value of our positions. One interesting program that was started actually at Michigan State University is that they did not have enough subject language or language knowledge to be able to catalog a large portion of their collection. So they called out to scholars and they called out to the local community, and they created a collaborative cataloging effort, which is something that we are also trying to bring to the Library of Congress. I believe that's it. Does any? Oh, I guess we don't want to do questions. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go for questions later as a group. I think it's very important to hear from people like yourself or Tabang about the state of the archives and the type of material that is there, and also to know that even though you might be doing research on South Africa, for instance, that a lot of valuable material is housed in other places across the globe. Sometimes even material that is lost to us here nationally. So last but not least, we have our own archivist here, Tabang Kanye, who is working at the University of Free State's Archives for Contemporary History. Tabang, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the opportunity to come and participate in this conference in the honor of, where he's gone now, Prof Bob Edgar. I took a decision to speak from the heart, Mr. Chair, with your permission, so that I can avoid being asked questions. I will try to be elusive as possible, so that I leave the congregants confused and tired, or maybe refreshed and enlightened. My name is Tabang Kanye. I'm an archivist. I work in an archive and I work with archives. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon once again. I have had a stint with the Department of Arts and Culture as an archivist as well. So my presentation will move from the National Archives of South Africa to the archives of the University of the Free State, Archives for Contemporary Affairs. I said I'm an archivist. I work in an archive and I work with archives. Archives are the contents of an archival building. Archivist is someone who's responsible for the management, collection, and care of those records. It's an archivist, archives. I said I'm an archivist, I work in an archive, and I work with archives. So an archive, it's a properly designed building where the records are kept. I want to ask all of you, or any one of you here, where do you keep your own personal records? In life, you are given birth, you are born, there's a birth certificate. You get to high school, there's a matric certificate. You go to university, there's a degree that is conferred, there's that certificate that you are given. You get married, there's a marriage certificate. You divorce, there's a divorce certificate. You die, there's a death certificate. You buried, there's a grave register. Even when you go to heaven, there'll be an attendance register that definitely you are coming. For an example, you are here as well. Some of you in the morning did sign in registers. Now I want to ask you, you've got all those records that you produce from your birth certificate until your the last, whether it's your divorce certificate or your marriage certificate or your baptismal certificate, you name it. Where do you usually keep them? In our sofas. Will they? That is true. You see, our weakness as people, we don't take good care of our records. And the very records are the basis. They contain information, you know, and evidence of the transactions that took place, definitely. It's indeed Kopano is here. He was born in 1996 on the 4th of September 1920. Definitely, here's a proof. The birth certificate is here. He acquired a qualification in history, wherever, whatever university, proof, certificate is there. Here's my son. He gets married. He brings a new wife into our family. That new wife, I die. There's a photographic album in the house of my mother, my father, my aunts, of all the events that took place in the yard, including birthdays, somehow even funerals and all these other things. What's going to happen to that collection of photographs? Some of them are stored nicely in a suitcase. Some are stored nicely in that, we had those old albums still kept properly. What's going to happen to those photographs that narrate the history of my family? The daughter-in-law, because she's got no relation to all those aunts and all those people that are in there, she's going to throw them away. Because they've got no relevance to her wife. All she wants is ours when we're in Durban or we were in whatever, somewhere else as well. They are damaged. On my arrival at this institution, I initiated programs to try and open up the archives, to make it accessible. I invited individuals to come and learn about our work. I called scholars that are responsible around photography. I did a project on narrating history through photographs. I placed a few photographs on display. I had someone who was doing the restoration of photographs, how to prepare, to safeguard and preserve your own photographs, including your CDs. So they were giving out presentations, and in that I was also promoting my function so that people can come and donate material that they think is of relevance for safekeeping. Another one, in our archive there, we've got collections of radio broadcasts. We've got speeches of a few, almost all these apartheid ministers, including Nietzsche and Dietrich and so on. Those speeches, they contain information that is very important about the evolution of our country until to where it is. You know, I was called by a lady, I think that was a month ago. She wanted a recording of Dr. Barnard, the one who did that the heart surgery. I managed to get that. It was in Afrikaans. I clipped, and cell phones are very important these days. I played it on audio tape. I recorded. It was like about 10-minute, 15-minute presentation on then I gave it to him. They were doing a science fair of some sort around specialists, African-speaking specialists who had done major, achievements in science and so on. So Chris Barnard was one of them. I got a call again from another brigadier who was doing this investigation on the Cradock 4. I think it's Mexico, US, Parum Conto, and others who were murdered. He was doing an investigation on that. He's from one company, I won't mention the company's name. They are doing an investigation on that. Last week, I think a week ago, I heard a report on TV when I was listening to the news about that case that I mentioned. I've been listening to some of the speakers here when they say the records are skewed about the voices of black people or communities are not there. But when you critically look at the records that are there, they are about all of us. The only thing is the language and the perspective that is being provided. Those people, the records would say you are a terrorist, but the counter narrative would say I'm an activist. Did you get it? Here is Laszlo is a terrorist. Huh? And then Luyanda would say Laszlo is a freedom fighter. You see, there are all those counter narratives. There's a contradiction in the archives. I remember there's one doctor I know who runs that basement. He was a founder member of SASO, it's a student organization at Tefluop. He wanted something, he checked, then I got him on one of the collections there. They mentioned him, he was a rabble rouser in Tefluop doing what. He was writing his memoirs, so he wanted to use that as part of the evidence that he did. I gave it to him. He was, he was thrilled. There are very interesting stories that I want to talk to you about. In our collection, we've got newspapers dating since the end of the Anglo-Boer War. We've got the Friend, Volksblad, there's a number, Volksblad, the Friend, Transvaler, there's a number of newspapers. At some stage, I organized a campaign. I invited reporters. I invited journalists. I compiled the two. I said the preservation of history through newspapers and radio broadcasts. I invited, the lady who just spoke said about Ike Morwe. I invited Professor Kiba, who did his research on the radio freedom. And I don't remember all those people, and maybe I'm confused because I'm looking at you. I used newspapers. I invited newspaper journalists. I invited radio presenters and I would say they are radio journalists, to come and discuss and tell us their experience about radio. I had Tamin Tenteni, I had Ike Morwe, Kiba, I think I had Cecil Sols as well in the program. So it was successful. In all those presentations, the last word is, guys, if you know someone whom you feel they've got important records that they can be donated to the archives so that they reflect all of society and from those voices that were marginalized. I heard, I think it was Ntatekam, and the other one said to me when I was at Coffee Day, he told me, we're not archivists from Free State, we want to hear from you. Then, currently, I went to a funeral in Brantford, no, Tennessee. I met someone who stays in Brantford. If you know, Brantford is there's a house where Winnie Mandela was banished. I drafted a project that we need to go and conduct oral history interviews of those people that interacted with Winnie during her stay in Brantford, so that her records are also kept in there, because not many people around here do know that Winnie Mandela stayed in the Free State at that time. So we can say, collect those oral history interviews, place them in an archive, create a session like this, maybe when we hand over those cassettes to our interviewees. And then we engage, particularly maybe for Women's Month, something like that, in honor of women. And I feel that her voice, especially after those dynamics that happened, she became marginalized somehow, but she had made a contribution into the country's evolution. I hope you are not going to ask me a lot of questions today. I want to keep my presentation very short, Laszlo. And I think I was audible. Yeah, sure, thanks. just before I closed, in fact, I saw his face and then I remembered. He expressed somewhere in his writings, I noticed, that when he was doing research in Lesotho on the LLB, he went to trash cans and, dubious places looking for records. He said there was an individual whom he had approached because they were somewhat under sanction. Then that gentleman went to behind a bent place to retrieve a plastic, collecting with a record with documents of some of their activities. So, like you were saying, your photographs are in a mattress. That gentleman was now, if that gentleman donated those records into the archive, wouldn't that be easy for us to access that information? Yes, because for me, I would arrange it, describe it accordingly, so that when you type the subject of interest, you will be able to find information. And also, our people are not willing to donate their records. Records are in America, records are in the Q, British, and what's that? Records are in the Irish Republican, what's that? PRONI, Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. Our records that are outside. I came across records of Ruth First and many other prominent people from our country. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tabang. First, you can't call me a terrorist just because I have a beard. But second, I think it's important what you point out, that we as researchers should sometimes work together with archives and libraries if we do have a project where we're working with families or something like that and trying to convince them to create perhaps donate papers or documents or other artifacts and donate them to a local library, a local archive that can take care of them, properly catalog them and share them with the community. Not just the academic community, but the community in which we live. So let's move on to question and answers. We had 3 interesting presentations. Oh, okay. Yep.
Can everybody hear me? Yes. Oh, good. Archivists, librarians, they are treasures. My life as a historian has depended on them. In almost every situation that and research that I've been involved with, they make a tremendous difference in terms of identifying sources that we may not be aware of. And the other thing that Ann Meagher was talking about was we can also create archives and augment what is out there. So I'd like to pay tribute to everybody on this panel because they really are the lifeblood that creates what we do. People have asked me, well, have you thought about moving to South Africa? Well, that's not out of the question, but the point is, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I have the Library of Congress. And it's an extraordinary resource. And so Aaron is sort of laying out that there are ways that we here in South Africa can utilize their resources. So that's very important. But thank this panel because I'm really appreciative of everything they've done for me.
Thank you. Would anybody like to ask a question? Okay, we have 2 hands over here, and Prof. Neil. Let me.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, I'm a member of the South African Broadcast SABC board, and what you're saying is true about broadcasting, that it's all in Afrikaans. when you look back. Unfortunately, I'm a historian, so I wrote a paper on 100 years of radio. And most of the narratives and inputs I wanted at the peak of South Africa's movements, they were all in Afrikaans. How do we even now move away from English into languages that are of origin to where they came from? And then the second part, how do you speak to young people, at least to limit their thinking that Facebook is an archive? Thanks.
Thank you. Our next question is by Professor Amupi.
Thank you. Abuti Tabang, I missed your presentation because I was losing my mind, tired, so I walked around. Erin, the same thing, but I'm going to ask you about for you to comment, Erin, on the 20-something boxes that you guys showed me that I must look at on South Africa. Fascinating. I only look at 3. I looked at Vuputatswana because Mujuta is doing PhD on Mangope, and I also look on the PC because of my boss Tando is doing APLA, and then I looked at the ANC because I'm working on centenary history of the ANC. So if you can comment on that one. That what Professor Peter Limp was talking about in terms of the archiving in Bloemfontein, that archives are mainly about the National Party. I want you to comment on that. Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, again. During the amalgamation of these universities, most of the archives, for example, Forte, the archives from even Lovedale back then, were taken, is either Rhodes or Cape Town, or others are taken to London. Because I come to a realization when I was doing the SS Mendy, as a play and as a documentary, that when I have to go to Cape Town, so there were so many red tapes, of which this is a story of my forefathers. So when I have to go to England, even getting the footage, that footage mostly has been taken here in South Africa, but now is owned internationally. So we as the people of South Africa, we don't have access to the real authentic archives of the time. If you are talking about 1800, then you have to dig deep and in your pocket also. So make me understand.
Okay, and I think one last question.
I think it's more of a comment. There might be a question, but I'm not 100% sure. So for me, I think that, I don't know if it's just South Africa or it's a global experience, but there's a need to understand the importance of archives and the use of archives. So as a young historian, I've grappled with a few components in my experience of the archives. So the first one is accessibility. So the idea of being able to travel to certain spaces to be able to access documentation because it's housed at a specific site, a specific archive. The other one is the idea that once you get to these spaces, the archives aren't well organized, it's not well documented, it's not well preserved. So I've been to archives very recently where the space itself is in such poor condition that the actual material is starting to deteriorate. So I recently visited the Queenstown Museum and I was inquiring about the Queenstown Representative, which is one of the oldest newspapers that we have in South Africa, and they have the original material that formed part of the newspapers. So they had newspaper clippings that they would incorporate into the newspapers from other newspapers across the empire, the British Empire. But these documents are so poorly maintained or preserved that they're starting to rot, to deteriorate, to tear. And I do believe that there aren't many copies of these materials. So the concern that the materials that are available in these archives aren't well preserved. But also on the flip side, the consideration of people, like local people, understanding the importance of their own lives and experiences as archives. So the understanding that the experiences that people within the rural areas, the locations, and more marginalized outside of the typical political highlighted spots, that their stories matter and are important to form part of an archive. So in a lot of experiences, in my instance, or in my experience rather, I have had many conversations with my grandmother about her experiences throughout apartheid, what she experienced, what her friends experienced, what her siblings experienced. And there is some form of documentation, but a lot of that generation consider their stories to be so small that it wouldn't necessarily form an important part of the archive. So how do we convince these people that their stories are significant enough to form part of the archives, but how do we also, how do we get the existing archives to be better preserved?
Thank you, and I'll abuse my position as a convener and add to that. If one has a collection, right, and we're working with people, etc., and you want to donate it to a library or an archive, what are the practical steps and what is a realistic trajectory for that material to be processed, first accepted, processed, and then made available? So I'm going to first ask our online speaker to see if she wants to answer any of the questions, and then I'll move on to the people who are with us today physically. And Major, would you like to comment on any of the questions that were posed just now?
Historian, but I think that the point is that one can make an archive, and the last question was about how you have combined the snippets of stories into something bigger, and that is the beginning of making an archive. If one does that, rather than simply having these snippets all isolated and separated, you can build up a collection. And the basis of any archive is a collection. It's a collection of materials, and I think that's what archivists depend on. They depend on people who collect materials, save them up, store them up, and then hand them over at a certain point. And with digitization, it is increasingly possible to have access to archives all over the world. It doesn't matter all that much where they are housed, these documents, if they are digitized. I must say I miss the feel of the physical paper, but at the same time, one realizes that you can disseminate far further if you digitize. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So many points on that one. I think the beginning of the repatriation of documents is an extremely important topic that people have been grappling with for decades now, and I don't think that there's a good, clear solution to it, because fundamentally what all of the through line of all of this is money, which leads to access. How do you justify to your administrator that this cause is worthy enough to put money behind it? Because when you're donating something, it's not just about the physical space, it's about who is going to process it, and how are you going to process it, how are you going to digitize it. So I think so much of that, to your question, comes back to interest. If you have a historian that's coming through, when you're collecting those stories, you're creating that archive. if you have that relationship with a library or an archive, you need to donate that as soon as you're through with it, or figure out a way to do that. There's a big conversation going on right now, and actually I gave a 45-minute talk about this at the last African Studies Association conference to my colleagues in the library and archives field. I gave a presentation about how do you justify your worth at your institution, and how sad is it in 2025, 2024 that we have to continue to do that, but we have to continually justify our worth and the need for us and the need for the collections. The through line of all of that is money, and the reason why things aren't being digitized. Yes, money, yes, cloud storage, etc. But one of the other big reasons is that administrators don't necessarily want to digitize things when they want people to walk through their door. When I made the justification for Omar ibn Said, a big part of my pitch was that we can digitize this, we can put this online. And they came back to me and said, well, if we put it online, then who's going to come see it? How do we justify to our overlords that we need to preserve this in our space if it's just going to be digitized? All of that is to say, it's an extremely tricky thing that we are all grappling with, and we could really use a lot of support.
Thank you, Tabang.
You know, as archivists, we're grappling with a lot of contradictions and complexities. I want to make you an example. If you know of the famous Rivonia trial speech that was made by Nelson Mandela, he made that speech in the first trial was in Johannesburg, then it moved to Pretoria, and those dynamics. The court proceedings were recorded on they call it dicta tape. Do you know a dicta tape? Do you know a dicta tape? Yes. A lot of you don't know a dicta tape. It is like, have you seen a cassette? But it's a bit thicker. It's cylindrical. It can fit like on a can of Coke. Then there's a needle that would read that. The speech was retrieved. The British Library was, they had dicta belts there. There was an individual who used to work for a company that created dicta belts. So they tasked him to reconstruct one of the dicta belt reading machine, to reconstruct it so that we can listen to the Rivonia trial speech. The one of Mandela was retrieved. Sisulu and the rest of the others were quiet, and they are also recorded on dicta belt. We initiated a project to resuscitate and read and listen to all those because they've been muted. They've been silent for many years, including Walter and all the number of those trialists. We got them, we bought a dicta belt machine, a reading machine, we transferred them to CD and all those modern technologies. In the process, we found a dicta belt recording of Dimitras Tsafenda. He's been silenced for so many years. It's only last week when I started to see a TikTok video of Dimitri Tsafendas being interviewed when he was explaining that. But on the dicta belt, when he was narrating, when he was communicating during his trial, you'd get something else, very rich, the history of our country's intelligence. And now I'm saying this because there's someone who's wants to launch a book on Vervoet on our campus. He used our material to write that book. And then when madam, you asked me about Facebook as being the ultimate. Yes, do you remember when I presented here, I tried to make my presentation to be as close as possible to yourself. when you look at your birth certificates, your matric certificates and so on, immediately when you start to learn how to keep your records, you'd be able to even differentiate, authentic material from non-authentic. Currently today we are faced with another challenge of AI and so many other things that messes the authenticity of our records and our heads. Facebook has a lot of information about anything you want, but it has no evidence. Last week I saw something on Sibiya and money. You noticed, if you follow these cases, something that is irrelevant from the case and it was on Facebook. So Facebook, you advise your kids that, hey, I cannot say this is real or not real, but if you are trained, you've got a trained eye, you are able to deal with such information. And Prof Neo, I don't remember your question. I had no. The records of the National Party. It's not that they don't have other voices. Records are about all the voices. The contradiction is between oppressor and oppressed. For an example, if we have all the records of the ANC in the archive, do we have the whole history of the country? No. So currently we do have records on the ANC. Even the oppressor, the National Party, made reference to the ANC. For an example, we have letters of Nelson Mandela that were kept by the then Minister of Justice, Kobi Kotie. And that collection is very important. It's consulted by people worldwide. They come for that collection. We've got, some of the recordings, minutes, correspondence about issues that relate to our transition to, the conflict between oppressor and oppressed is well documented and thoroughly preserved. You come there, you will understand the evolution and the dynamics that were involved when you go to that collection. And with us, currently, we're initiating programs that would entice that people like yourself and the rest donate their records so that we keep them there. But it's challenging. Laszlo mentioned the relationship between researchers, archivists. If we cooperate, then we will win. I wanted to invite you for a tour to the archives, but it appears that we will not be making it because we've been dislocated by that protest there. But those of you who find time can come to the university archives and visit so that I show you some of the things, and if you misbehave, I lock you in a strong room. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thandolwethu, what is the next step?
This is the end of this session. Thank you, colleagues, for this archival session. Thanks, Dr. Laszlo, for your chairing of this program. Colleagues and friends, we've got the last session for the day. We tried to chase the time, but unfortunately we could not. It's 3 minutes to 5. The next and the last session for this conferencing is going to be led by Dr. Absalom Nkosi. But there is just a quick announcement that needs to be made about an aspect that needs to be announced quickly. After this announcement, then Dr. Nkosi will come and lead this session. Out of this session, Mr. Ayanda Ndlovu is not present to present, but it's only the other 3 speakers. Just the announcement and then we proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Neo, and your leader here. I'm Sehwai Santu. This time, I'm representing Mohokare Trust. Mohokare Trust, I'm a trustee of Mohokare Trust, established by Professor David Ambrose, a very close friend of Professor Bob Edgar. He has the best collection of everything on Lesotho, which he's been collecting in the last 50 years. He's 86 years old, he's a mathematician, came to the University of Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland. His wife, who's late now, may her soul rest in peace, was a botanist. They have the best collection of a specific country on everything, from history to zoology to botany to meteorites. Now, he has also compiled a biography of Basotho, notables. And Dade Bob is one of the notables. And yeah, please do. And so he's written a short letter, which I'll read quickly, and then hand over the latest biography of all key Basotho in the last 200 years to him. And Prof now will take a photo, so as I can show David Ambrose that I have actually performed as a trustworthy trustee. Dear Bob, sorry not to be present on this important occasion, but you'll realize that I am a few years ahead of you in terms of age. There was the so-called war to end all wars, and I was born before it, whereas you were born after it. It's referring to the Second World War. It's more than 40 years since we met, and it is thanks to you that we met one of the few Basotho born in the 19th century that I knew and even accommodated. Edwin Thabo Mofusengana, 1899 to 1995. Dade Mofusengana used to reside in his, together with Dade Bob, in David Ambrose's cottage at the university. And one of the many from Southern Africa for whom you rescued and published biographical details, even going to Moscow to do so. Through you, we also kept in touch with Litiani on some of your almost annual visits, and we marveled at your remarkable relationship, even working together in recent years on Black Lives Matter campaign in the USA. I'm hoping that one of the members of Mohokare Trust, Sehwai Santu, will be able to represent us. The trust is active, and its latest publication extended the Lesotho annotated bibliography by more than 350 pages in August this year, with a volume on British rule 1884 to 1966. However, the most relevant volume in relation to yourself is biography. And while the 221 hard copy had a short entry on Bob Edgar, the soft copy is forever expanding, and he has included the longer version of the latest entry on Dade Bob. The soft copy is forever expanding, and your new, much enlarged entry is enclosed, and I have it here, which will appear in a second, probably 2-volume edition. If you already have the main volume, this one that I'm presenting, please pass this one on to a suitable institution such as Howard University Library of Congress. The Library of Congress already has it, with all good wishes for a successful occasion. David Ambrose, Chairman, Mohokare Trust, and Mamtlongo Mapisa, Secretary, Mohokare Trust. And I hereby hand over to Dade Bob the most comprehensive biography of who is who in Lesotho. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you need to say something?
Yeah, this is a totally unexpected, but really welcomed. David Ambrose has been a dear friend for at least 45 years, and I've spent many a day with him. David likes to talk, but he's an extraordinary resource. And all I had to do, he's kind of like artificial intelligence. You just push a button and out comes this extraordinary wealth of knowledge, not only about Lesotho, but other things as well. But his trust has created this extraordinary resource that I hope some of you will be using. Some of you may have used it. But it's, again, a legacy that David Ambrose has created, not only for Lesotho, but this region. So I'm really touched to receive this volume from David, and of course my friend Sahwai Santo, who I've known, he claims, since the late 1970s, when he was a student at the university. I used to call the students the radical students at the university, the howlers, because they were quite vocal about their positions. But this is a real treat. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I almost said mic check 1 2 1 2, simply because I'm from the music background. So I'm the only person here from my department, but I'm not lost because we are in the humanities together. So I've been tasked to chair the session. Can I please have all the... Okay, is everybody here? As far as I know, only Ayanda is not here. So can you please have the first presenter, Mujotu Muhlame, and the topic is Diturupa, World War and Commemorative Performance in South Africa. Thank you, sir.
Dumelang bagolo ba gaetsho ke re dumelang bagolo yo e mengfa pele ga lona ke gabo mo khatla namele setlhare tše boreku ke ba khatla ba mo setla magana le kgomo ke mo setla magana le namane e rile khafela tsa bogosi mo setlhare ke a gana ke magana go buswa ageng. Let me first greet Prof Bob Edgar and thank him for really, being what in Setswana we would call petleke ya malemela gotlhe. And what petleke ya malemela gotlhe means is that, it's a peak that really goes into all types of farming. So we want to thank you for really, being a resounding scholar of Southern African studies. And as we are busy with the decoloniality and decolonization of South African history and historiography, your work has really touched us. And I think, you've laid the path by really focusing on South African individuals who have been marginalized, because many of us talk about decoloniality and decolonization, but we are not willing to do the work of going into villages and townships and really documenting the history. So we thank you so much, and we also thank you for supervising our supervisors. I always tell Prof Neo that because he went to Howard, we also got a chance to go to Howard one way or another. So thank you for that as well. Let me start. So my topic is on the Trupa, and I chose this topic. It actually comes from my master's degree. So I was supposed to do a history of Makapanstad, Bakatlaba Mosetla in Pretoria, and then I stumbled upon the Trupa, and then I decided, instead of doing a history of Bakatlaba Mosetla, to do a history of the Trupa. And Prof Neo, there's this thing about when you are in a history department and you're not in a history department, you can't supervise. I actually went to him and I asked him to be on my supervision team, because we also deserve to have a supervision committee and not be supervised by one supervisor. So I asked him to say, you are in history education, but look, your PhD at Howard, I've read it, it's available on ProQuest, and I asked him to come and be part of the team to supervise me, because he was focusing on struggle songs on Robben Island, and I found that to be relevant to my own study. So the trooper comes from the word troop, which means soldiers, and also the French word troupe, right, which has to do with performance. Why the trooper? I chose the trooper because this element of commemoration commemorates World War I and World War II. So African soldiers went to France, and actually after the war they saw military parades by the Scottish soldiers and the French soldiers, and then they came back home to Makapanstad and actually started performing these performances for their Khosi, which means their chief. But it actually comes from this marginalization of Africans in the world wars, right? But when you look at the literature that has looked at marginalization of Africans in the world wars, it mainly focuses on the combatants, you know. But now this project was focusing on how these combatants come back home and actually create a sort of like a merging of African and European culture and sort of commemorate the war in their own vicinity. Because the story that we know is that African soldiers during World War I and II got a pair of boots and bicycles. So the trooper, events like the trooper challenged that narrative to say they actually did commemorate the war in their own communities. And this is important because if you look at a lot of the work of Professor BoB Edgar, it looks at hidden histories. And most of the time as historians, we don't really go into the performative. We tend to want to do liberation histories. We don't really look at these other alternative histories. So this also gave me a chance to move away from struggle history because I did my honors on Nkgopotse Tiro. So it gave me a chance to do something different and contribute to social history. So the Trooper is part of carnivals around the world that emanate out of speaking back to colonialism and histories of slavery, such as Carnival in Trinidad and Carnival in Brazil and Kapsetlopse in Cape Town. So this is how we situate the Trooper to say it is a commemorative performance of black soldiers in World War I and II, but it's also part of a larger historiography and history of black people around the world coming out of this tradition of slavery and colonialism. The key feature of the Trooper is the merger of African and European identity and cultural iconography coming together in this harmonization. So in the Trooper you find Scotch. Scotch is the Scottish kilt, right, that they wear as they drum about and as they parade. They also have drums. They have traditional African drums and European drums. They also have parades and marching, dancing, singing, whistles. So this also speaks to cultural appropriation, you know, taking the European culture and making it African for yourself, because, you know, there are many debates that we have to say, is it really African if there is an element of European culture in it? African people commemorate and memorialize the two world wars in their own context and environments and link to broader histories such as the sinking of the SS Mendi in 1917 and liberation struggle culture. I really struggled in my thesis to bring out the link between the struggle culture and the Trooper, because I couldn't find military veterans either from MK or APLA or Azanla who were actually involved in the Trooper, which I hope one day to really find them and link them to this commemorative aspect of World War I and II. The Trooper merges elements of performance, clothing, culture, songs, drums, choreography, and traditional leadership, which is Bohosi, because it's a community effort meant by the whole community. So one thing that is interesting about this is that, you know, government is only now coming to the party after 100 years, where they are now sponsoring. But it's still, like, even if tomorrow government says there's no sponsorship, the event will continue. And this actually speaks to the commemorative efforts of Africans. When we go back into the archives 100 years ago, our communities were really, you know, they were pace setters. They would go to court and challenge certain things and fight for land. But today, when you go into like villages and other communities, it's like people are begging, and they don't know that their ancestors were pace setters and, you know, trendsetters who did things for themselves and were so self-determined. In my last part, it's the recommendations. There is a need to support the Drupa without gentrifying it. So on the 25th of December, every year on Christmas, you go to Makapanstad, and they basically have these displays and competitions. But now there's that element of gentrification that is creeping into the Drupa, because now it's about the prize money. It's no longer about the commemorative performance that happens. So these are some of the challenges that the Drupa is facing. So, you know, gentrification, I mean, we always look at our towns, and you know, you have this part called downtown where you can get food for 10 rand and so on. So imagine if that part dissipates from the town. It means then, like, ordinary people or working class people or poor people do not have a part of the town. So even with events like the Drupa, it's important not to gentrify it, because if you now say 100 rand to enter a stadium, it sort of loses that communal aspect and balance. So there's a need to archive the yearly performance and create data for researchers, archivists, community members, and performers to refer back. The Drupa is part of the history of World War I and II and the marginalized black participation in these wars. Oral histories of the Drupa unlock community histories and broader historical conversations. So it was not just, the history was not just about the Drupa, it was also about the community's history, but using the Drupa as a vehicle of understanding. There's a need to include the Drupa in the history curriculum in schools and universities, and the National Museum of Military History. I mean, we have a National Museum of Military History in Parktown in Johannesburg, but when you go there, you find that a lot of the displays are focusing on a certain, you know, idea of World War I. I mean, when you think of places like Delville Wood and that commemoration, you know, but then we have a commemoration like the Drupa, which needs to be included. And researchers like myself need to be part of that project, as inspired by people like Prof BoB Edgar. We can no longer be academics in the ivory tower. We need to go down to the communities, and community engagement needs to be part of our work as scholars. And then I just want to also talk about something. Makapanstad, this is in closing. Makapanstad is part of the Setswana-speaking world. We no longer refer to communities as tribes. We refer to them as communities, and we are ambitious in using these words that will affirm and validate our communities, because words like tribe tend to keep us back, you know, as people who are static and unchanging and hug to the colonial nature of our identity, or the way the colonizers saw us. So, you know, there's this language called Sipitori, and Sipitori, I also argue that it's part of the Drupa. And, you know, people have this perception that when you come from Pretoria and you speak your brand of Setswana, you're not really Motswana enough. And the Drupa sort of challenges this perception, you know, because when you go to the Setswana-speaking world in December, most of the areas do not have cultural festivities. You have the Kwaere in Botswana, you also have the Tubaruba, which is a military commemoration of Kgosi Sitjele, who fought against the Boers in 1852. But, you know, the Drupa also comes as a military commemoration. So for me, that was showing Botswana in other parts like Mafikeng, Rustenburg, and other places that, you know, the same people that we sometimes undermine to say their language, their dialect of the language is not good enough, are actually one of the few communities who are preserving the history and culture of Botswana, because the trooper is also part of the history and culture of the Botswana, who also participated in the two world wars. So I just want to say that coming from Pretoria, Prof Neo, is not, there's nothing wrong with you. The way you speak, it's enough. As a Motswana, you are enough. You can go to Motsweding FM, you can go wherever. You do not have to now change your accent to, suit the Mafikeng perspective, etc. Because, as we do these histories, we also have to push back against certain colonial narratives. Because, the first Bible in South Africa or on the continent was translated into Setswana by Moffat. And Moffat used a particular dialect to translate the Bible into Setswana. So for me, the fact that, when the standard of language was created, certain dialects were kept out. So we are still harking back to the coloniality of language to say, but you don't speak a good part of the language. You need to change your aspect. And culture is culture. Pretoria is a trans-provincial area where you've got Mpumalanga, Limpopo, Northwest, and Gauteng. So you cannot expect those people not to be influenced by Sepedi, and other languages that are around them. So for me, the trooper was also speaking back to this notion that, culture is only found in certain spaces or areas. When you say you are looking for isiZulu culture and then you talk about Ulundi or, but when you go to Pongola, now you're like, is it really or not? So for me, I think as historians, we also have to debunk certain myths about our own cultures and actually, be critical to say, no, where does our culture start and end? And problematize what has always been accepted to say, this is where you find the culture. Because you can go to certain places, but you realize, but the culture is not 100%, and culture is everywhere. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mtate Mhlamme. Can we please move on to the next speaker, Bale Sakadi? The next presentation, as you can see, it's Ruins of Promise and Possibility, Red Location, Memorialization, and the Scholars Return to Community. Thank you, ma'am.
Good afternoon. I've asked for a... Sorry? The link? Okay. Okay, so I can't connect here at all. All right, we'll probably pay it. I'll have to, as a historian, narrate. My name is Bale Sakadi Mkijima, a mother to Refilwe Kadi and Vusama Zulu Mkijima. I'm putting myself as an insider here, having some form of authority. I was born in Red Location, in New Brighton, Gqeberha, a place formerly known as Port Elizabeth. I've drawn the work through the narrative and the archive of Rory Riordan, who was a municipal official and a politician and a liberal who then became also a consultant in this big project. I'm also drawing my narratives and readings from Lefebvre in spatial theory. It's part of my PhD project at the University of Pretoria. I left the University of Witwatersrand, Wits, because my initial project was harming me as a person. I have read on the TRC. I started reading volumes, and in my realization was that the works that I was reading on, the transcripts, were also about people I knew, people from my street, people from my area, people from my clan. people who also, were part of the growing up of my parents. And in reading that and how they were harmed by the system, especially physically, the type of trauma, the type of detention they received, then I moved away. Then I went back to my alma mater. I said to Prof Leslie Wirtz, I'm stuck. No one wants to supervise me anyway in political science in terms of the cost of freedom. That was the initial topic of my first works. And then I moved on with Professor Murray. Leslie Wirtz has been my mentor, including Siraj Rasool, Primesh Lalu, Terry Barnes, and the whole UWC troupe, who also took me to Robben Island Museum, where I met and worked with Prof Ndate, brother Prof, I call him, when we worked at Robben Island, and also Ndate Kwezi Mpumlwana, the one with the red scarf. So, but also I encountered and worked with my history tutor, Noel Solani, Dr. Noel Solani, who taught me Inkani, how to be cheeky in the setups and in the space. He was very adamant and would ask you more than once in terms of what is it that you mean, and give you a perspective. So I've been fortunate to have been brought up by my brothers and leaders in the space as well. I continued then to read the work of Bruno Latour's, perspectives, James Scott's, and on state-led schemes. But mine was to also look at alternative forms of memorialization in terms of, should we really be looking and all be reading about liberation, and in what form and characterization? Then I said, memory, let me continue with that. In that almost 10 or 12 years, I wrote about the work of establishing community museums in South Africa, South End Museum, which is more of your District 6 scenario, your Sophia Town scenario. That was the works that it took me into history and a perspective that carried me through the works. In that work as well, this took me to a realization that, yes, there's land restitution, but how come I still go from the township of New Brighton and have to take 2 buses or 2 taxis just to get and be by the beachfront? And elements of why am I not part of the rate owners in that setup of the beachfront? But then I continued to read more and became closer to Prof Gary Minkley's work on social change, and he's done quite a lot of work with my colleagues as well on museums and communities at UWC and Forte. My path contained tensions between planning and the promise of infrastructure, the official memorialization and the local experience. Does it mean that today a multi-million infrastructure being closed just from a demise of the community protesting against housing? I would have loved at least then the second email I sent, that then the pictures flow as well of the ruins of this infrastructure. So we continued then to look into the conceptual promise, the feeling and the enablement by lack of care through political storms, political norms, and just an IDC attitude that I do not care. But how do we locate the community and the ambition of an architect? And when we say architecture as a discourse as well, are there sentiments attached in terms of what type of building, cement, and character of a building that we put, and in which type of scenario? A multi-million infrastructure was put right in between shacks, parallel development was continuing with poor housing quality, RDP houses. Communities would from time to time relate in what was termed as ungrateful manner to the municipality, toying and wanting the cracks of the houses to be reformed. The museum, the art galleries, the marketplaces, the digital libraries, the theaters were being built all around them. And yet there were issues, continued issues of sewage and bucket system right in a 100-meter radius from where they lived. I'm also touching base on this work, looking at the TRC hearings and who came with the idea of a museum in a community of New Brighton. It is Ernest Malgas. There is a picture of the Archbishop Tutu crying, I think it was on the second day of the TRC in East London, having his head down, not being able to continue with the proceedings. And what he was hearing was a man in the name of Ernest Malgas, or Ernest Sinqukwana Malgas, who also broke down in tears in a wheelchair, having had stroke, having had been imprisoned in Robben Island, having been burned, and lost and used most of his life towards the liberation of South Africa. All he said to Rory Rodan that what will work is a museum for people to remember. But he did not specify the magnitude, the gigantic infrastructure that then was delivered to the people of New Brighton and that of Port Elizabeth. Dr. Alex Borain continued with the TRC hearings that late afternoon, and all we could hear was that South Africa has had to, all of us, in fact, honor the moral giants who underwent interrogation at John Foster Square and many spaces of detention in South Africa. I continue to work and look into how red location is. Like any township, there's always a rail. It's either there's an industrial, there's a rail works, and then there's a township. And it speaks sense to the capital and capitalist formation of towns that we live in, that they must come, get to the station, go to work and come back, or go above the bridge of the station and cross and come back. But also it is to show that Gqeberha, former Port Elizabeth, is an industrial city. I locate this to the Cape to Cairo train. There's a, what is our train now in Gauteng? Gautrain. There's Viwem Geddes who speaks about the Gautrain and the whole notion of a speed train. And each time I think about that and locate New Brighton, red location, which is 100, 200 meter, and being born next to this rail station, one had temperaments and feeling of understanding of what time does each day the train leaves and the last train, because you will even hear from your house the trembling and the going-ons of the noises. But also as a historian with perspective, there are two sentiments one remembers, really as a scholar and a human being. It's the train and the feeling of a passing train, but also the one of a helicopter roaming way too close to your space. That one reminds me of riots, particularly the 1986 and 1985. So some of the traumas keep on coming back in different forms. And I experienced this during the July riots when they happened in South Africa. So we continue then to look into how these men came and stood and were part of red location, and how and what it meant. I look into Stimela, the work of Hugh Masekela. I look at why Rory Riordan continued with the work. All right, thank you. Yes, and then I look at why Rory Riordan. Riordan worked with Black Sash. He was the editor of the journal that was also banned at some point called The Monitor. I'm sure that at Tabang we might have some, there's a picture I'm looking of for this journal. I found it in my home in a very, safe space. I think I was 8 years or 9, and then I took it. All I found, it was bulky, but I found a picture of a man with a tape around his eyes. That was my first interaction with censorship. When I looked at it, I asked my father when he came back, who is this? Why is he blindfolded? Then that's when I heard the story of Nelson Mandela, and I was told not to tell other children that there's a book like this at home. That must have been probably 1984 in New Brighton. I continued to read and work with Riordan, who wrote about apartheid Stalingrad. Comments from Antjie Krog on the book. He says, of all those detained without trial in South Africa, 1/3 came from the Eastern Cape. It was apparently assumed in security circles that whoever crushed the Eastern Cape would control the country. So it has always been a contested space, Eastern Cape and New Brighton, where I come from. But also, Dion Pretorius at NMU says that let us all continue writing these books, going back to our communities in all forms, because there are more than 1,000 books written about the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, and there are continuing narratives even today. Does this mean that have we had enough time to reinforce the choices that are made, and how we go back to our spaces, including the works and histories of the township? I continue to look at how we know museums and what type of museums and what alternatives do we have for memorialization. Thank you very much. I would have loved that we look into that 1-minute clip just to show and redraw our emotions of trauma, but our recollection of space, as I have done. My project is almost done, Brother Professor Neo. I am concluding and submitting in January at the University of Pretoria. Thank you.
Can somebody please be my timekeeper? Reimagining music education and practice in higher education, advancing inclusivity, diversity, and social justice through decolonialization and decoloniality. I met Dr. Neo a few months back when he launched his book about Izingoma Zomzabalazo. As I said, I'm not a historian, so he, from a music perspective, invited me to be a discussant about the culture of singing, especially in prison, because that was based on Robben Island. I'm not saying I'm a specialist in prison singing. So that's how I met Prof. Neo. And I asked him why he's inviting me, and then he said I must come and meet Bra Bob. And I thought of Bra Bob, our own Bra Bob from Zimbabwe. But now I see it's another Bra Bob. But since I've been sitting here, I've learned to know who Prof BoB Edgar is. I've learned a lot, and I've also been partially in Harvard University since I sat here, because I had the history and also the history of African studies. And I must say, I am not a leader. As Prof BoB said, I'm a foot soldier. So I'm going to present about what I'm doing in the music department in terms of pushing decoloniality in the space which I am in. Well, quick background, I arrived here at the Bloemfontein Ordained School of Music 2021 as the subject head of music education and practice and the subject coordinator. So my presentation is about the process which I've gone through to try and bring decoloniality into the space. Well, as a teacher, of course, my teaching philosophy, it's about, diverse, culturally diverse music education and music education curriculum and pedagogy. And yes, of course, I got invited because me and Prof Noah, we share the same perspective and frameworks. I'm an Afrocentric and Pan-Africanist teaching and philosopher. Therefore, I include that in my teaching methodology. Well, as you know, from the International Policy and Convention, the UNESCO Framework of Culture for Education, and the Convention on Protection and Promotion of Diversity of Cultural Expressions, and Convention of Safeguarding of the Intangible Heritage, Cultural Heritage, affirms the importance of cultural diversity, inclusivity, and social justice. Therefore, I'd like to define the terms in this presentation, the working terms. By decolonizing curriculum, I mean incorporating African musical arts education in the music education and practice modules curriculum. Therefore, redressing what Professor Ramon calls epistemic racism. Because when I got here, the whole curriculum was based on West and American content, while the demographics of the students were different. So by diversity, I mean cultural diverse music education curriculum content and diverse music pedagogies, including indigenous African musical arts practice, philosophy, and theories. Inclusivity, I mean diverse music philosophers, diverse in terms of gender and race and method, using cultural responsive pedagogy, therefore employing pedagogy of care and on social justice, which it's redressing epistemic racism and sexism. Now the problem statement is that when I arrived here in 2001, the Odayon School of Music of the University of Pretoria lacked practical indigenous African music performances, cultural and historically relevant curriculum content, and culturally responsive pedagogy in the teaching of some African music aspects and concepts which were taught. This presentation is to take you through the redress, not the redress, the reform which I did for the past almost 5 years, and also to share my findings after I've done an online survey with the students about their experiences. The theoretical frameworks which the project was informed was the transformative teaching and learning and the cultural diverse music education. Well, since I'm in the midst of historians and in the political space, as well as spiritual space, I think I should also mention that the political intellectual philosophers that I look at and philosophies, that of Julius Nyerere, Education for Self-Reliance, and Ramon Grossfugel, Decolonial and Pluriversality instead of Universality. And then Gunguwa Tionga, Education should serve the people, not the system. And Steve Biko and Kwame Nkrumah, the approach to Afrocentrism, consciousness, and Pan-Africanist. Therefore, the first step I took between 2021 and 2022, I introduced Western African scholars, which of course are black, and South African scholars, and introduced traditional oral drumming and modern African classical drumming, which included philosophers like Nzewi, Nketia, Makene, and Muhulu. And then in 2022, I introduced indigenous African vocal repertoire students, where students were taught to play guitar and sing their indigenous songs. That was to do the representation of the demographics of my students, which there were Sotho, there were Xhosa, there was one from Namibia, there's Afrikaans, there's English. So just to make the curriculum be about them, they had to bring songs from home. Subsequently, in 2023 and 2024, I introduced Duma Koyane, which is a one-string instrument, and uhadi and Zimbabwean marimba, with the philosophies of traditional Zimbabwe music performances. And I also, part of diversity and inclusivity, I introduce philosophers or music pedagogies such as Princess Makoko Zulu, Dizu Plachis, Matosini, Zendanel, Nofishi Dwili, Tandega Mfinyongo, who is my generation. Therefore, the purpose of doing this was twofold. The first was to promote practical performance skills in performing on indigenous African musical instruments and vocal repertoire. Because African music is seen as an archaeological study, while it's actually a continuum. As you said, culture is continuing. So there are people who are performing. So in the spaces that I find myself in, it's more on Western classical music. So our students don't have the real awareness of what is happening in the real world. If you go to Joburg, you cannot say, no, I'm a classical musician. You need to be a musician. You need to play with different musicians. So this, hence the transformative framework shaped me. And the second one was to include African indigenous musical pedagogies in order for music teachers so that when they go and teach, they can promote cultural diverse musical practices and pedagogies, including indigenous African musical arts performances. Then the philosophy which I use, or rather the chart which I use to teach, that's where I come in as a historian. I just realized now after the presentation. Well, first, they learn about the different music genres. They must learn the different indigenous languages or the terminologies, which is promotion of African language and theories. Then they must learn about the practice, whether it's secular or it's sacred, or so they learn about the culture of where that indigenous music comes from. And then I teach them the philosophers, the most dominant. Like if it's Uadi, I would teach them of Matosini, so they know the person. Therefore, we are historians, or I think I'm a historian, and I'm archiving people which are not necessary in the curriculum and in the textbooks. So then we have the performance skills. That's where they practically perform. And then the teaching materials, I use workshop with indigenous musicians, I use the YouTube videos, I use group discussion, and they have to compose and perform their own pieces. In conclusion, what I found out from the survey is that incorporating indigenous African music into music education curriculum promotes cultural diversity and multicultural music education. It also empowers student teachers with culturally responsive pedagogies. Music education students at the Odeon, where I did this reformation, and I took them, and then I threw it, and I make them to respond. So I'm talking about those students. They are open to diverse musical practices and theories. And students' demographics and the location of the music department should guide the process of reforming the content of the music education curricula. Charity begins at home. So if I find myself here where there's a Sutu dominance or Basutu musical practice, it is only relevant to incorporate them. The last one, incorporating local music practices into music and music education curricula promotes social justice and cultural relevant music education curriculum content. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Now I come in as a chairperson. Thank you to all the presenters, and thank you for your professionality and collegiality of keeping into the time restrictions. To the audience, as you have listened to this presentation, it seems as if it was about performing or performance archiving and performing arts and education, decolonization, or hashtag curriculum decolonization. Therefore, I open the floor for questions to the three presenters. Can we please have all the participants or presenters coming to the front? Number one is up there. Can somebody help? Ash.
We only have 2 presenters. Oh. Oh, you. Man, how did we do it that you chair and present? Yeah, okay. So I'll start with you, my musician, that I'm 3 years here in the university, but I only got to know you like after 2 years, or even after 2.5 years, and look at we're doing the same thing. So when we started our university, Dr. Palesa and Dr. Mujuta, you must receive it because I see it. When a new staff member comes, we need to make sure that he goes to different departments, meet, because I've lost a lot of time, which I could have done with worked with him. It's the same with my professor Roland from Cameroon. We met in 2011 doing the same thing in a panel at AISA. He was looking at decolonization of African history, Africanization. I was doing the same, we're in the same panel, and we clicked. We are brothers now. I know his family, he knows my family. I think that's important because we talk about the communities of Dr. Edgar. I think it was a comment for that, so that the others who are going to join, we must meet them. Palesa, your presentation is very emotional, and I'm asking myself, can we do our history without being emotional? It's a question, because it's still a question to me, The other thing, Mujuta, I felt like you were intellectualizing, you were scholarshiping me, towards the end of your project, about how when you get into a space, look, I'm from Harankua, I went to UNIBO, and I went to University of Natal, and I went to Robben Island, different provinces, and I went to Howard. So everywhere I went, I don't have to change my accent. But you learn very late that you don't have to do that. You get into a space, they'll say, I'm sorry, Professor Edgar and Erin, who are Americans. The Americans who haven't left America, they think America is the world, I work in a project with Erin where we're working with Azarias from Tanzania and Professor Charles, who worked at Fort Hare on a Fulbright or something like that. It was a very international space because they didn't see me as an African who comes from the elephant in your street and all of that. But others, my first year at Howard was very, I still going to write about it, that experience, because, they were saying you have an accent, you have an accent. Everybody's got an accent. Everybody's got an accent. Everybody's got an accent. So those are the issues. I don't know if it's a comment, but I will leave it there.
Thank you. Can we hold on to all the questions and then we'll answer?
Ashe. So my question is for Mujuda. I'm from Pretoria, very proud Pretorian, and my grandmother is from Dertag, which is a small village, KwaManskral. So I've always grown up seeing the Trupa happen, and from a young age I've always wondered why are these people marching in the streets? What's happening? So I only learned, I think 2 years back, about the history behind it. So my question is, in your research, were you able to find out if the history of this event is being taught and communicated to the youth? Because this is mostly used to get them off the street. And are they aware of, or have they been made aware that about the important part of the history that is behind what they are doing? Yeah.
Thank you. Here's number 3, just in front of me.
Thank you to all the panelists for the work you do in disrupting the different spaces that you're in. Mine are just comments. And to Mujuda, as you were presenting about the Drupa, I was just thinking of because I did some work on the Drupa in 2017 and 2018. I'm not sure when you did your master's, but it's one project that I've just I've shelved it, and when you were speaking, I was just thinking that perhaps one needs to go back to, but I also want to take you up on the challenge to, you spoke about the military history in Joburg. I'm from Ditso Museums of South Africa, and that is one of our museums, although I'm based at the Cultural History Museum. And let's do an exhibition and disrupt that space. So we'll talk after this. And to Prof Ngosi, I was also thinking about when you mentioned about Princess Magogo. I was thinking of the times when I was part of the Opera Africa, when we were doing Prof Legacy, Kumalo's work on Princess Magogo, and I would really want to speak to you about that, the work you do after that. But the next time you are in Pretoria, please do come through to the Cultural History Museum, because we have this big collection of indigenous instruments, which I think you will find really interesting. It's also another area that we haven't really done much on, so it would be great to speak about that and for you to visit. Thank you so much. Oh, but lastly, sorry. Sisi, when you spoke about Ubaba Noel Solani, I could really relate to your sentiments, and congratulations in advance for the completion of your PhD. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much. What a beautiful way to get towards the end. I have a couple of questions. And today you talked to us about the songs and revolution and that. I'm curious, is there a body of work on revolutionary songs in Afrikaans? And is there a body of work, like contemporary Afrikaans in the time of the anti-apartheid struggle? But also, I'm very curious now, within the SADF and in the context of the Anglo-Boer War, what did the Afrikaans people sing? And other Afrikaans people who are not classified as white. I would like to know if there's any research in terms of that and what does it show. And then, Prof, you talked about very interesting music genres and decolonization. Now, a few years ago, jazz was inscribed as International Cultural Heritage of Humanity. No, it was not jazz, and also a few years later it was reggae, proposed by Jamaica. Now, something interesting is happening. They talk about hip hop, mapiano, gqom, stratamia, and those kinds, and probably others whose category I don't know, but they are implied in what you were listing. And I could not help but think, as you were talking about Professor Mangu's conversation earlier on about urbanity, about modernity, and I choose to add urbanity into it. How in this polyversalities that you are introducing, we can get young people doing business and working and getting recognized, because most of the time these are treated as subculture, and prospects for success depend really on temporary popularity, as it were, and there does not seem to be sustainability. And so I work in the business of heritage and in the heritage of business. So I'm curious about the business of music in the context of these ones that have been marginalized in the past. And then lastly, Ms. Palisa, you touched on something very close to some of us. And I know there is no time, but I would like to preface it by saying, when we entered the space of transforming museums and cultural heritage, one of the things that offended us profoundly was that when we tell the story of the liberation struggle, we are advised that, no, you must not go monumental. It must be soft and portable. So if you look at the women's monument, you know, the Mbogoto, which I worry someone can steal one day. But if you look at, in the State University of Moscow, but also the State University in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, you enter there, these three men are up there, whoever is in charge, you cannot even reach or remove them. You will not hear that their statue fell, because it's so monumental, it's so big, it's not accessible. There's the other one in the hill in Pretoria, next to Freedom Park. It also will not fall for a long time. And we've always wondered, this requirement for that heritage that represents such a monumental struggle, it must be very small, gentle, and soft. But all the other heritages are allowed to be big, massive, and monumental. So, having said that, what are the lessons that you get from red location? Does this apply to most other comparable memorials? And is it safe to draw the conclusion that no, it's not safe to tell this story in a big way? We must keep it portable and pocket size, in line with some of the suggestions that have come up. And I know the issue of alternative forms has come in to say there's no money to be doing such things. We must do real things now. Yeah, thank you very much.
That was a long one.
Thank you. The next speaker, can you make it concise? Okay. Thank you very much. Can all the respondents please be concise? Can I start, please? Right, I'll start with the questions which were directed to me. Firstly, thank you for the invitation. I'm definitely going to come. About the Africans' struggle songs, I do not know anything. Maybe Prof Noah can answer that. But I think if we go to a specific Afrikaans orientated like Atikafie or a congregation whereby they or Anglo-Boer Museum, then I think that's where we can get, you can get maybe to ask such questions, and then they might give you a most definite answer. The last question, the only way which I've seen a lady going to idols playing Uhadi. She was singing Ntinga Ntinga Ntagandini. So she brought the indigenous instrument into the modern or urban music competition. And then Matosini and other artists, they actually recording in a more popular culture or popular setting using those sounds. So I think the business of bringing indigenous music or instruments is in collaborating with whatever the culture is moving towards, because culture is moving, and as long as we know historically that this is the context and practice of those traditional instruments, but now we are taking them out of context, we are recontextualizing them. So I think that's the way which the music business with the indigenous instruments can carry on. So basically through collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Prof Neo, with regards to the accent, I also agree with you. I think you're also talking about it on a global scale, and I was just more focused on it on a cultural context. Then I would say it's the Trupa is being taught to the youth, but it's more like, you know, keeping them off the street and teaching them informally. It still has to, you know, have that formal process, which is still a big challenge, you know. And it's where we come in as well and assist, because sometimes you don't have to wait for the formality of something. You can actually do it, like have a summer school in the region and, you know, have 100 kids and, you know, for 2 days and teach them about it. Because sometimes we wait too long to do things and nothing ever gets done. Then definitely the exhibition, it's important that we have it in those spaces. Thank you.
Thank you. I forgot to disclose, I work for the National Heritage Council with Kwezi over there, and yes, thanks to their support also. I think what Kwezi, you're giving me a vivo question. I'm sure the panelists are going to ask me this. But also combining that with Neo's question of emotions, being a historian. Remember red location in that picture, the building is imposed amongst shacks in between. There's a failing RDP. Oh, oops. There's a failing RDP buildings. They are already cracking within 2 years of that. Now, when you look at how monumental is and gigantic the structure is, and when residents see loads of cement being unpacked by the same government, they're waiting to repair their homes. I think from that rationale, then it begins, questions must be asked. Is this the same government that we voted for? And when you enter those houses, you can actually, when you are inside, you can see outside through a cracked wall. So it gives one a lot of questions in terms of architecture, meaning, and people. Space development and creative city making, because Red Location, New Brighton and Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha is a creative city, which I have a question for you. Can panelists ask themselves? Then emotions. Red Location, it's a shantytown shacks built from Boer Wars. They relocated them from a place called Utnik into Port Elizabeth to create a township residential for migrant workers in Port Elizabeth, former Port Elizabeth. Now, these stood for more than 100 years. By the time I returned from Robben Island to work for the municipality, they were still homes to people. And when you ask, the question is, even myself, my birth certificates, it says Red Location Block 53 F2. That is my maternal home. That is where I was born. All I say is this was never even supposed to be a residential for any human being. I think that's my conclusion in that. I am putting aside emotions, what we had to endure. Like many South Africans, the decent housing was a fantasy during those times, but they stood there for longer. The third one is to my fellow panelists. I think I'm coming from a creative city, Port Elizabeth, from Zimngawana to Pindamtya to, I'm just calling those because as I was writing my thesis, I say then, vandalism of that note in a cultural institution, what could have brought that? Then I start reading Duduzo Makatini's works, and he writes about the trauma, the frustration of Zimngawana after the vandalism of his studio in Walkerville, Johannesburg, the Zimology Institute. And then he says it's the system that made this. That's what Zim said, Brazim. Brazim says it's the system, and Brazim, remember, stays almost 500 kilometers from my house where I'm staying in New Brighton. He said that these people, it is not their fault that they had to vandalize. They had to take brass from my piano and so on. So what becomes of creativity and the elements of teaching? I know your students are quite flexible. We have Mandisi. Mandisi, in fact, stays opposite Brazim's home. Mandisi Janjis. So the wealth, and we don't write about them. Pindamtya was the first cohort to go for Lion King in the US, and they all stay in a less than 5 kilometer radius, and we don't have histories on them. How is music education also? You're saying now you're coming through towards the discourse of history as well. Is there an interest in that we facilitate as quick as we can those narratives that are not there? Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the question, and also thank you for the promotion to professor I receive. I just want to declare I am not a professor. I'm only a senior lecturer, but thank you. You're very kind. Regarding the research in music education, there are masters and PhD students and honors who write about other musicians. Now there's a master's student who's writing about Amapiano. No, there's other one who's writing about Black Coffee. And I know Nduduzo Makatini is writing about other musicians. So there are biographies. Yes, yes, those ones. So there are biographies, but I think furthermore, it's that the interdisciplinariness should continue. Nothing stops a historian to go to a music department, and for a music department to say, listen, I want to learn about this instrument, then I go to the archives, then I go to say who played it, you know, who's well known. So I think this can be dual. Thank you for the questions, and I think this brings us to the end of our session. Now I'm giving it back to Prof Neo. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you. Hello? The thing when you have the last session is like, we don't give them time, we're pushing them out. But ladies and gentlemen, if you look at our program for now, We have a braai evening. If we had if we didn't have protests on campus, we're going to have two edutainment. We were going to have a 60-minute theater production. I really want to thank Professor Anthea van Jasveld and Dr. Nkosi. They are the one who facilitated that, and Miss Lucy, I can't remember the last name. And also we're going to have the marimba group band. They were going to entertain us as we were waiting to eat. So that is of the program, because, you know, they say the marimba instrument, last time they were transporting them, they got broken, they're very sensitive. And the 60-minute production, you know, we had booked a stage there, so they were gonna do it there. So when we moved here, they said, you know, unfortunately they are not gonna be able to do those. We're gonna put them in the edited volume to thank them, because they really wanted to help us. The other thing was Professor Ndile was going to summarize the keynote. We are not gonna do that. He's gonna write them, and the section on Prof Nyor to talk about the proposed edited volume. We will going to contact you about this, but this is the end product that we want to have. We want to have an edited volume on all the sessions that we have done. So you'll be given an opportunity to work on your presentation and then submit it. We'll talk about that in due time. Now, we're going to move from here. We're going to have a braai dinner that side. Professor Edgar is going to have the final words. It doesn't mean that's the end of the conference. We still have the full day tomorrow. For those who are not here, who are presenting tomorrow, we have 2 sessions tomorrow. We're gonna start at the same time, 8:30. We'll be doing it that side. So what time is it now? My watch is frozen here. 6:15. Maybe we can take a break of 15 minutes as we move to that side, and then we can start at 7 o'clock. We had given them, because they're going to set up there, we've given them that we'll start at 7 o'clock, but production will give you time. Once you finish, even if it's 15, we're not rushing anyone, then you can tell us you are done. And then they'll be giving us a dinner there. And then Dr. Bob, it will be your stage now to reflect, to give us your comments, what you are thinking about on the 2 days that we have done. Is that okay? No, that side. But I'm asking if you're okay or you want to protest because you are an activist. Okay, so thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for coming here. This has been a very historic meeting of all people who are even online, wherever they are. I want to continue to say that we didn't have a funding for this, but when Thando Loetu becomes the president, let me remove it from myself. I know he'll make sure that things like this get funding. And when we talk about funding, we don't mean the university, right? There are people who are outside who can give you 50 rand, you know. Can you imagine the 50 rands that we have here? We're still paying the service providers as we speak. That's why I'm going to ask Erin, how much do we have in the kitty there? if we don't have anything, you are not going home. Okay, I'm withdrawing that because, you know, you have that famous president. Okay, so we can move. We're moving to the where we had lunch, but we're going to have a break until, if we can get there like 6:45 or 7 o'clock, and just relax. The other thing I had asked if we can have some music. I don't know what we will have there in the meantime. Do you have any plan there? Okay, I'm done here. I'm just talking to my boss if he's got music.